I stood in front of 12 family members in a 320 silk dress, the one I bought after finally getting promoted. The one I'd never told anyone about because they never asked about my life anyway. Then my sister's 8-year-old son grabbed the back and ripped it down to my underwear. The room erupted in laughter. My father, "Boys will be boys." My mother, "At least it wasn't an expensive dress." My sister smirking, "Don't be so dramatic." I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I just picked up my purse and left. But what they didn't know was that for the past 6 years, I'd been paying for everything. Their Netflix, their health insurance, my nephew's private school tuition, even the mortgage on the house they were sitting in my name, was on that loan, not my sister's. By Monday morning, I removed myself from every single account. By that night, my phone exploded, 47 missed calls, 89 messages, voicemails screaming that I was tearing the family apart. But I was just getting started, because when they finally came to my door, desperate and panicking, they had no idea I'd already called my lawyer. And what she found in those documents. That's when this family's carefully constructed lies began to crumble. My name is Christina Hartwell. I'm 35 years old, and for the past decade I've built a successful career as a senior financial analyst at Morrison & Klein, one of the largest consulting firms in the state. I own a modest 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighbourhood, drive a reliable Honda Civic, and have more in my retirement account than most people my age. On paper, my life looks exactly how I planned it. But if you ask my family what I do for a living, I'm not sure they could tell you. It was late September, one of those crisp Friday evenings, when the leaves were just starting to turn, and the air smelled like wood smoke and possibility. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, staring at my phone, reading the group chat message that had come through an hour earlier. "Family gathering tomorrow night, 6 p.m, Mum and Dad's house. Please confirm attendance." That was it. No, hope you can make it, or would love to see you, or even a simple, "How have you been?" Just logistics, a calendar invite to my own family. I set the phone down and looked around my quiet apartment. The walls were decorated with framed certificates, my MBA diploma, my CPA license, the award I'd received last year for outstanding performance in my division. None of my family had ever seen them. They'd never asked to visit my place, never expressed curiosity about how I'd furnished it, or what my daily life looked like. I was 35 years old, and sometimes I felt like I was still waiting for them to notice I'd grown up. The pattern had been there my entire life, I suppose. I just hadn't wanted to see it clearly until recently, when I was 17 and graduating high school with honours. My parents missed the ceremony because my older sister Emily needed them at her piano recital across town. "You understand, don't you, honey?" Mum had said on the phone. "Emily's so nervous, and you're always so strong. You'll be fine." I'd walked across that stage alone, searching the crowd for faces that weren't there, and told myself it didn't matter. When I graduated, summa cum laude from college, 6 years later, they missed that ceremony too. Mason Emily's 2-year-old son had a fever of 99 degrees. Not dangerous, not an emergency, just enough to keep them home. I'd stood in my cap and gown, surrounded by other families, taking photos and cheering, and felt that familiar hollow ache of being the child who was always strong enough to not need celebration. The thing about being labelled the strong one is that people stop checking if you actually are. They just assume. They assume you're fine with being overlooked because you've never complained. They assume you don't need help because you've never asked for it. They assume your feelings aren't hurt because you've learnt to keep your face neutral when they forget you exist. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that for the past 6 years, I'd been keeping their lives afloat. The Netflix account they watched every night, my credit card, the family health insurance that covered Mum, Dad, and Emily. I added them to my company plan and paid the premium out of every paycheck. Mason's private school tuition, $800 a month. I'd been auto-paying that since he started kindergarten. The roof repair on Mum and Dad's house last year, $12,000 they couldn't afford. I'd quietly written the check and called it a loan, though we both knew it would never be repaid. Over 6 years, I'd funneled close to $100,000 into keeping my family comfortable, and not once had anyone said thank you. Not because they were ungrateful exactly, but because they genuinely didn't seem to register the sacrifice. I was just Christina. Strong, capable, fine on her own Christina. The daughter who didn't need anything. I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the navy blue silk dress I'd bought 3 months earlier, right after my promotion to senior analyst. It had cost $320 more than I'd ever spent on a single piece of clothing in my life. I'd never worn it. Never told anyone about the promotion actually, because I'd learned long ago that my achievements were met with polite nods, while Emily's smallest wins were celebrated like national holidays. Her spa business was constantly struggling, losing money every quarter, but somehow that made her more worthy of attention. She needed help. She needed support. She needed everyone's energy and concern. And I was fine. I was always fine. But tomorrow night, I decided sliding the dress off its hanger, I wanted to be seen. Just once. I wanted to walk into that family gathering and have someone notice. Notice the dress. Notice me. Notice that maybe, just maybe, I had a life worth asking about. I had no idea that by Sunday morning everything would be different. Saturday arrived with the kind of bright autumn sunshine that made everything look deceptively cheerful. I spent the afternoon telling myself this dinner would be different, that maybe wearing something beautiful would shift the way my family saw me, or at least prompt them to see me at all. The navy silk felt cool and smooth against my skin as I checked my reflection one last time before heading out. The dress had a delicate bow, detail at the back, intricate and lovely. The kind of thing that made me feel for once like I wasn't just functional Christina, but someone worth a second glance. I arrived at my parents' house at 5:40, 20 minutes before the official start time. Old habits die hard. Mum was in the kitchen, pulling serving dishes from cabinets, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she consulted a recipe card. "Oh, Christina, wonderful you're here," she said without looking up. "Can you set the table? The good china is in the dining room hutch. And maybe arrange those flowers someone sent. They're on the counter." No comment on the dress. No, "you look beautiful," or even, "that's a pretty colour." Just immediate delegation. I swallowed the disappointment and got to work laying out place settings for 12, arranging the roses someone had sent for Mum's birthday last week. I'd sent them actually, though I noticed the card had been thrown away, and Mum probably didn't remember who they were from. Emily arrived at 6:40, a full 40 minutes late, breezed through the door with Mason in tow, and her husband James trailing behind looking apologetic. Sorry, Emily called out in that musical voice she used when she knew she'd inconvenienced people but expected to be forgiven. Mason's soccer practice ran long, and then we had to stop for his special juice boxes, because apparently the regular kind gives him a stomachache now. Mum rushed from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and wrapped Emily in a hug. "Oh, we were worried. We waited dinner for you." Dad emerged from the den where he'd been watching the pre-game show and clapped James on the shoulder, then bent down to ruffle Mason's hair. "There's my favourite grandson." The fact that Mason was his only grandson never seemed to diminish the enthusiasm of this greeting. I stood near the dining room table, invisible in my expensive dress, watching the reunion as if observing a play I wasn't cast in. No one had worried about whether I'd arrive. No one had waited for me. I'd simply been expected to be here the way you expect the furniture to be in its usual place. We finally sat down to dinner at 7. I noticed immediately that there were place cards at each setting, little cream-coloured cards with names written in Mum's careful handwriting. Everyone had one, Mum and Dad at the heads of the table, Emily and James on one side with Mason between them, Aunt Susan, Uncle Tom, Grandma Ruth. Everyone had an assigned seat, a small signal that they were anticipated planned for. Everyone except me. When I hesitated looking for my name, Mum glanced over. "Oh, just sit anywhere, honey. You're flexible." I took the empty chair between Uncle Tom and Grandma Ruth directly across from Emily and tried to ignore the tightness in my chest. Flexible. That's what I was. Flexible enough to not need a place card. flexible enough to not need consideration. Dinner conversation flowed around me like a river around a stone. Emily launched into a detailed update about her spa renovations, how she was adding a salt therapy room and a couples massage suite. "It's a huge investment," she said, eyes bright with excitement. "But James and I just feel like it's the right time to expand." Everyone listened intently, asking questions, offering encouragement. Mum beamed with pride. Dad nodded approvingly and said something about ambitious entrepreneurship. Then Emily shifted to Mason's achievements at school. He'd apparently been chosen for the advanced reading group and had scored the winning goal at last week's soccer game. She recounted both stories with the kind of detail usually reserved for historical documentaries, and everyone hung on every word. Grandma Ruth clasped her hands together and declared him exceptionally gifted. Uncle Tom joked about getting his autograph before he became famous. In a brief lull, Dad turned to me. "Work's still good, Christina." My heart lifted slightly. Finally, an opening. "Actually, yes, I just got promoted to senior analyst and I'm leading a new team that's working on—" "Oh my goodness," Emily interrupted, her voice rising with sudden urgency. "I forgot to tell you the funniest thing Mason did on Thursday." And she launched into a story about Mason mixing up the words frustrated and flustered during a family discussion, and everyone erupted in laughter. My sentence hung in the air, unfinished and forgotten. No one noticed I'd stopped talking. No one circled back to ask what I'd been saying. I picked at my chicken and tried to make myself smaller, the way I'd learnt to do over 3 decades of family dinners. As dessert plates were being cleared, I noticed Mum and Dad exchanging glances across the table. It was subtle, just a slight raise of Dad's eyebrows and Mum's almost imperceptible nod, the kind of non-verbal communication couples develop after 40 years of marriage. Something was coming. I could feel it. "We should all catch up after dessert," Mum said brightly, her tone just a shade too casual. "Maybe coffee in the living room." My stomach tightened. They wanted something. I could always tell. This whole dinner had probably been building toward whatever they needed to ask me. Another loan for Emily's business, probably. Or maybe they needed help with property taxes again. Something that required my wallet to open while my presence remained unacknowledged. I was so focused on trying to decode their intentions that I almost didn't notice Mason. He'd been unusually quiet during dessert, but I'd caught him staring at me several times throughout the meal. Not at my face specifically, at my back, at the dress. I'd turned once and seen his eyes fixed on the silk bow, his expression curious and focused in that intense way children get when something captures their interest. "Mama," I heard him whisper to Emily, his voice low but audible in the lull of conversation. "Can I touch it?" Emily glanced at him, then at me, then back to her coffee. "Touch? What sweetie called it?" "The pretty bow on Auntie Christina's dress." Emily didn't answer. She just returned her attention to something Aunt Susan was saying about her garden. The question evaporated, unanswered, into the ambient noise of family chatter. I should have paid more attention to that moment, to the fact that Mason had asked permission, and Emily had simply ignored the question rather than saying no. I should have understood what that silence meant, but I didn't. I was too busy bracing myself for whatever financial favour was coming, too busy swallowing my disappointment that no one had mentioned my dress, too busy being invisible. So I didn't see Mason slide off his chair, didn't register the soft sound of his sneakers on the carpet as he walked around the table, didn't sense him approaching from behind until his small fingers were already reaching for the delicate silk bow at the small of my back, while Emily watched from across the table and said absolutely nothing to stop him. I felt the tug first, a gentle pressure at the small of my back right where the silk bow was fastened. For a split second, I thought maybe the chair had caught on the fabric. Then came the second tug, much harder, and I heard Mason's small grunt of effort as he pulled with both hands. The sound of tearing silk is surprisingly loud. It's a clean, sharp rip, like fabric screaming. The bow gave way first, then the seam, and suddenly the entire back panel of my dress was splitting open from my waist down to the hem. I felt the cool air hit my skin, felt the fabric falling away, and in the fraction of a second before my brain fully processed what was happening, I knew. I knew that everyone could see my undergarments. I knew I was exposed. I knew that the one nice thing I'd worn to feel beautiful had just been destroyed in front of my entire family. I shot up from my chair so fast it scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech. My hands flew behind me, trying desperately to hold the torn fabric together, but there was too much damage. The dress hung in tatters. I grabbed my napkin from the table, pressed it against myself, my face burning with a heat so intense I thought I might actually burst into flames from sheer humiliation. 12 pairs of eyes locked onto me. 12 family members frozen mid-conversation, staring at me standing there half-dressed in my parents' dining room. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then my father laughed. A deep, hearty chuckle that started in his chest and rolled out across the table. "Boys will be boys," he announced, shaking his head with amused affection, as if Mason had simply tracked mud on the carpet or spilled juice on his shirt. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, but not in horror. In that gesture people make when they're trying to suppress a smile. "Oh, Christina," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of mild exasperation reserved for people who are making a fuss over nothing. "At least it wasn't an expensive dress. You can just change when you get home." I looked at Emily. Surely Emily would understand. Surely my sister, another woman who understood what it felt like to be exposed and vulnerable, would step in, would reprimand her son, would show some sign of empathy or concern. Emily glanced at Mason, who stood frozen near my chair, looking uncertain about whether he was in trouble, and gave a small shrug. "Mason," she said in a sing-songy voice that held absolutely no authority, "say sorry to Auntie." The way she said it made it clear she thought I was overreacting, that this was a minor inconvenience at worst, an amusing anecdote at best. Mason looked up at her, reading her tone perfectly, the way children do, and giggled. Actually giggled. Then he turned and ran toward the living room, his little feet pounding on the floor, not a single word of apology leaving his lips. I stood there, napkin clutched behind me, waiting for someone to do something, to say something, to acknowledge that this was not okay, that I was hurt, that I deserved basic dignity and respect, even if I was the strong one who supposedly never needed defending. Uncle Tom cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. Aunt Susan studied her dessert plate with sudden, intense focus. Grandma Ruth murmured something about children having so much energy these days. And then, as if an invisible director had called for the scene to resume, everyone simply went back to their coffee and cake. "Crisis averted," Emily said brightly, as if a crisis had occurred and been successfully resolved, rather than me still standing there in a destroyed dress that cost more than a week of groceries. "Who wants more coffee?" Mum asked, already standing to refill cups, her eyes carefully avoiding mine. Not one person asked if I was okay. Not one person offered me a sweater, a jacket, anything to cover myself with dignity. James Emily's husband looked vaguely uncomfortable but said nothing. Dad had already turned to Uncle Tom to resume their conversation about football playoffs. The room had collectively decided that this moment was over, whether I was ready for it to be over or not. Something inside me cracked. Not broke exactly, cracked, like ice on a frozen pond when the temperature starts to rise. I could actually feel it, a physical sensation in my chest, something that had been holding firm for 35 years suddenly developing fractures. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to make this right. They were going to do what they'd always done, which was minimize my feelings, dismiss my pain, and expect me to be strong enough to absorb it without complaint. And for 35 years I had been. I'd absorbed every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked and undervalued, and I told myself it was fine. that this was just how families worked, that I was being too sensitive. But standing there in the ruins of my $320 dress, watching my family eat cake as if nothing had happened, I realized with sudden crystalline clarity that I was done. I was so profoundly, completely done. I picked up my purse from where I'd hung it on the back of my chair. The motion was calm, controlled. I didn't slam anything, didn't raise my voice. "I need to leave," I said quietly. Mum's head snapped up from the coffee pot. "What? Don't be dramatic, Christina. We wanted to talk about something, that's why we invited you for dinner." There it was, the confirmation. They'd invited me because they wanted something from me, not because they wanted my company, not because they valued my presence, because they needed something. "I'm leaving," I repeated, already walking toward the front door. "Christina, honestly," Mum called after me, frustration creeping into her voice now. "It was just an accident. Kids do these things. You're making everyone uncomfortable." I was making everyone uncomfortable, not Mason, who'd destroyed my property. Not Emily, who'd failed to supervise her son or teach him boundaries. Not the entire family who'd witnessed my humiliation and responded with laughter. Me. I was the problem because I wasn't absorbing this gracefully enough. I didn't respond. I walked out the front door, leaving it open behind me, leaving my untouched slice of cake on the table, leaving the coffee Mum had poured for me growing cold. I walked to my car in the driveway, the evening air cool against my bare legs, and got in. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the still open front door, I could see into the dining room. Emily had Mason on her lap now. They were both laughing about something, her arms wrapped around him in a protective, affectionate embrace. The kind of embrace no one had offered me. And suddenly, like a photograph developing in a dark room, a memory surfaced. Earlier in the evening before dinner was served, I'd been in the kitchen helping Mum. Emily had been in the hallway with Mason, her voice low but audible if you were paying attention, which I hadn't been, not really, but now the words came back to me with perfect, terrible clarity. "Auntie Christina doesn't mind jokes, sweetie. She's tough. She's not like other people who get upset about little things. She's tough." The words I'd been hearing my entire life, the label that had given my family permission to treat my feelings as expendable. And Emily had taught it to Mason, had given him explicit permission to view me as someone whose boundaries didn't matter, whose dignity was negotiable, whose pain was funny. I put the car in drive and pulled away from my parents' house. In the rearview mirror, I watched the lights growing smaller. I watched my family continuing their evening inside that warm, bright house, probably already forgetting about me now that I removed myself from view. They had no idea what was coming. Neither did I, honestly. But as I drove home through the darkening streets, still wearing the ruins of my beautiful dress, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never, ever go back to being invisible Christina. The strong one. The one who didn't need anything. That version of me died tonight in my parents' dining room. What replaced her, I was about to discover. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the turns, the stoplights. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles had gone white. When I pulled into my building's parking garage and killed the engine, I sat in the silence, still wearing the destroyed dress, still clutching the napkin from the table. The overhead light shut off automatically, leaving me in darkness. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for tears to come hot and angry. Long enough for the crying to stop and leave behind something harder, colder. Long enough for the numbness to crack and reveal what was underneath rage. Pure, clean rage at 35 years of being treated like an afterthought. When I finally made it upstairs, I peeled off what remained of the dress and threw it in the trash. I took a long shower, letting the hot water pound against my shoulders until the bathroom filled with steam. When I got out, I pulled on old sweatpants and a college t-shirt, poured myself a large glass of wine, and sat down on my couch as the clock ticked past 10. And then the memories came. Not gradually, but all at once, like a dam breaking. Decades of moments I'd filed away, minimized, explained away as no big deal. Suddenly, they weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were a pattern. I was 10 years old when I went flying over my bike's handlebars and landed hard on my left arm. I heard something snap and the pain was so intense I couldn't scream. A neighbour drove me home. Mum took one look at my swelling arm and said we needed the emergency room. But then, Emily started coughing upstairs. Just a cold, but Emily was 12 and terrified of being alone when she felt sick. "We can't leave her," Mum said. "Your father's at work." So I sat on the couch with frozen peas on my arm for 6 hours, while Mum fussed over Emily's fever. When Dad finally got home and drove me to the ER, the doctor said the delay meant the bone had started healing wrong. They had to re-break it to set it properly. To this day, my left forearm is slightly crooked, a permanent reminder that Emily's cold was more important than my broken bone. I took a long drink of wine. I'd always told myself Mum had been in a tough position, that she'd done her best. But sitting here now, I realised other parents would have called a neighbour, would have found a solution that didn't involve letting their 10-year-old sit with a broken bone for half a day. Mum hadn't been in an impossible position. She'd made a choice. She'd chosen Emily. When I was 16, I discovered computer programming and fell completely in love with it. I saved every birthday dollar, every bit of allowance, every paycheck from my library job for 8 months. $387. Enough for a refurbished laptop I'd found downtown. The day I came home, excited to show my parents the listing, I found Mum at the kitchen table with bills and a stressed expression. Emily needed $400 for piano competition entry fees. "Christina, honey," Mum said, looking at my envelope of cash, "you're so smart. You don't need a computer to learn, but Emily needs this opportunity. She has to work twice as hard for half the recognition." I handed over the money. All of it. Emily went to the competition and placed third. Got a small trophy that sat on the mantel for years. I went back to learning programming from library books and begged computer time from the school lab. I told myself it didn't matter that I was being selfish for feeling resentful, but it did matter. It mattered that for 8 months I'd deferred every small pleasure and it had been taken away in a single conversation. It mattered that Emily's third place trophy was more important than my dreams. By midnight, I was pacing, too agitated to sit. My college graduation, the proudest day of my life, summa cum laude, top of my class. I'd worked my way through with scholarships and part-time jobs, never asked my parents for tuition money, and on graduation day, I walked across that stage alone. My parents hadn't come. Mason had a fever of 99.8 degrees. Not dangerous, just enough that Emily panicked. "You understand, don't you, Christina?" Dad had said on the phone that morning. "You've always been so independent. This is just a formality anyway." But it wasn't just a formality, not to me. I'd watched other families taking pictures, cheering, crying with pride. I'd stood in my cap and gown searching for a familiar face that wasn't there. When I got home that evening, they were watching a movie. Mason's fever had broken hours earlier. "Oh, was that today?" Mum had said, glancing up from the TV. "How did it go? How did it go?" As if I'd been to a dentist appointment instead of completing 4 years of academic excellence. I'd gone to my childhood bedroom and cried into my pillow and told myself I was being too sensitive. But I did need validation. I'd needed it desperately. And they'd known I needed it somewhere deep down, but it had been more convenient to believe I didn't. At 2 a.m, I was still awake at my kitchen counter with my second glass of wine, and the painful truth finally crystallized. This wasn't love expressed poorly. This was systematic emotional neglect, and it had been happening my entire life. They hadn't failed to see me. They had chosen not to see me because it was convenient, because I was the low-maintenance child, and low-maintenance children get low maintenance. Because somewhere along the way, They'd decided I was strong enough to not need what other people needed, and that belief had given them permission to ignore me. And I had let them. For 35 years, I'd believed the narrative too. I'd believed I was the strong one who didn't need help or attention or basic acknowledgement. I'd made it so easy for them. My laptop sat on the counter, its screen dark. I opened it with trembling hands and watched it glow to life. The search bar blinked, cursor waiting. My fingers hovered over the keys and then I typed, "How to remove yourself as co-signer on family debt." As soon as I hit enter, a worse thought struck me. I didn't even know the full extent of what I was tied to. I'd signed papers over the years without reading them carefully because I trusted my family, because they'd told me it was just a formality, because I'd believed that family helped family without asking questions. But sitting here in the harsh light of 3 a.m, wine-buzzed and emotionally raw, I realised I needed to know exactly what I'd been financing, exactly what obligations bore my name, exactly how much being the invisible daughter had cost me in dollars and cents. I pulled up my credit report and waited for it to load in my heart, pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. At first, everything looked normal. My car loan paid off 3 years ago. My mortgage current and in good standing. A few credit cards with low balances. And then I saw it. Home mortgage. Balance $172.40. Account opened March 2020. Status current, but 2 payments recently late. I stared at that number. I didn't have a home mortgage for that amount. My condo mortgage was different, smaller, under a different account number. This was something else entirely, something I didn't remember. And the fact that payments had been late meant my credit score had taken a hit. I scrolled up to see the number displayed at the top, 650. 650. My credit score, which had been 780 2 years ago, had plummeted to 650. I remembered applying for a car loan last spring, excited to finally upgrade from my 15-year-old Honda. The loan officer had looked at me with poorly concealed pity and said my debt-to-income ratio was too high. I'd been confused, checked my accounts, found nothing wrong. Eventually, I just kept the old car. Now I understood. This ghost mortgage had been dragging down my credit for years. I abandoned the wine glass and made coffee, my hand shaking. While it brewed, I tore through my file cabinet, pulling out every folder labelled with family members' names. If I'd signed something, I'd have a copy. 20 minutes later, I found it, a manila folder labelled Mom and Dad, House Stuff. Inside were refinance documents from March 2020, when the world was shutting down for the pandemic. Dad had called me one evening, his voice tight with stress, and said they needed to refinance to get a lower interest rate. The bank wants an additional signature, he'd said, just a formality for processing. Would you mind? I'd met them at a title company office during my lunch break. Everyone wore masks. The notary had pushed papers across the desk, pointed to signature lines, and I had signed where I was told. The whole thing took 15 minutes. Dad had thanked me for being so flexible, so understanding. I'd gone back to my apartment and thought nothing more of it. But now, reading the documents with clear eyes and growing horror, I saw the truth. I wasn't just an additional signature for processing. I was a co-signer, fully legally responsible for this $180,000 mortgage if my parents defaulted. And according to my credit report, they'd already missed payments. My hands went numb. I set the papers down and stared at them. A co-signer. How had I not understood what I was signing, but I knew how? Because Dad had called it a formality. Because I trusted him. Because I was the strong one, the capable one, the one who helped without making a fuss. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet. If I was going to understand the full scope of this, I needed to see it all in one place. Every dollar I'd spent on my family over the past 6 years. The first category was easy. Streaming services, Netflix, Spotify, Disney+. $35 a month times 72 months. $2,520, next health insurance. I'd added my parents and Emily to my company plan when Dad's employer stopped offering coverage. $450 a month taken directly from my paycheck. For 6 years, $32,400 while I'd skipped my own dental appointments to save money. Mason's private school tuition. Emily had enrolled him in an expensive Montessori program, and somehow it had become my auto payment. $800 a month for 48 months, $38,400. The emergency loans were harder to track because they'd been sporadic. $500 here for Emily's business supply order, $1,000 there for Dad's unexpected car repair, $2,000 when Mum needed dental work. I went through old Venmo transactions and bank statements, $8,500 in loans that were never discussed again, let alone repaid. Then there were the big ticket items. The roof repair on my parents' house after a storm. $12,000 because they didn't have homeowners insurance with a reasonable deductible. The HVAC system that died during a heat wave. $600 to repair it. I added a final line, home repairs and emergencies. $600. The total at the bottom made me feel physically sick. $94,420. $94,420 over 6 years. I'd paid for my family's entire existence, funded their comfort and convenience, and not once had anyone acknowledged it. But that wasn't even the full picture. I created a second section, outstanding liabilities. The mortgage co-signature, $180,000. Current balance, $172,250. My legal responsibility if they defaulted 100%. I added the two numbers together, 94 for 20s in direct payments, 180,000 in liability. Total, 244. I stared at that number until my vision blurred. $274,420. That was the cost of being the strong one. The price tag for being low maintenance. And suddenly, with devastating clarity, I understood what last night's dinner had really been about. Mum's comment about wanting to catch up after dessert, the meaningful glances between my parents. They'd needed something from me. Again. And I was supposed to sit there and quietly agree because that's what Christina did. Christina said yes. Christina was flexible. Christina didn't make things difficult. The dress incident had probably thrown off their timing. They'd planned to ask me for money or another signature, and then Mason had ripped apart my dignity, and they'd all laughed and I'd left before they could make their pitch. I pulled out my phone and searched for the mortgage company's customer service number. It was barely 8 in the morning on a Saturday, but I needed to know exactly what I'd signed up for. The line rang 4 times before someone answered. Sterling Home Loans, this is Marcus. How can I help you? I'm calling about a mortgage account. My voice sounded surprisingly steady. I'm listed as a cosigner, and I need to understand what that means exactly. What happens if the primary borrowers miss payments? There was a pause. Some keyboard clicking. Can I have the account number, please? I read it off from my credit report. More clicking. Then Marcus's voice, professional but tinged with sympathy. Yes, ma'am. I'm showing you as co-signer on this account. If the primary borrowers default, you're fully responsible for the debt. Your credit is impacted by any late or missed payments. As for rights, you have the right to make payments on their behalf, but you can't remove yourself as co-signer without their refinancing the loan without you or paying it off entirely. And if they can't refinance if their credit is too poor, then you'd remain on the loan until it's paid off or the property is sold. I thanked him and ended the call. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear. From rage so pure it felt like electricity in my veins. I looked at my spreadsheet one more time, at the evidence of 6 years of systematic exploitation, at the price I'd paid for being seen as strong enough to not need anyone's care. They had no idea what they'd created. They'd built their comfortable lives on the foundation of my silence, my compliance, my desperate need to be useful since I couldn't be valued. And last night, when they'd humiliated me and laughed, they'd cracked that foundation beyond repair. I closed the laptop and stared out my kitchen window at the brightening morning. Monday was 2 days away. That gave me time to think, time to plan, time to decide exactly how much being the strong one was going to cost them. Spent the rest of the weekend in my apartment ignoring the 2 texts from Mum asking if I was feeling better, and one from Emily asking if I could send her the contact information for my accountant. Even after what had happened, Emily still saw me as a resource to be tapped. But I wasn't that person anymore. Or, rather, I was choosing not to be that person anymore. I woke up at 6, made coffee and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a notepad. I'd learned in my years as a financial analyst that successful execution requires methodical planning. You don't make emotional decisions about money. You make strategic ones. And this was about money. It had always been about money. At exactly 8 o'clock, I logged into Netflix, found the account settings. My hands didn't shake as I removed my credit card and replaced it with nothing. The system warned me that service would continue until the end of the current billing cycle in 2 days, then automatically cancel. Perfect. That gave them 48 hours to figure out their own entertainment. Spotify was next. Then Disney+. 3 accounts that had existed on my credit card for so long, I'd stopped thinking of them as optional expenses. Except they weren't my electricity or my groceries. They were my family's convenience, and I was done being convenient. At 8:15, I called my company's health insurance provider. I need to remove 3 dependents from my coverage. I said, reading off my policy number. My parents, Robert and Linda Hartwell, and my sister, Emily Hartwell. Of course, Mum, I can process that request, but please be aware that changes to coverage require 30 days' notice per your policy terms. 30 days. A month. That gave them time to find other coverage. I wasn't trying to leave them with a medical emergency. I was just done being their insurance provider without acknowledgement. That's fine. Please process the removal. At 8:30, I opened my email and found the address for Mason's school administrator. I'd been emailing Mrs. Patterson for 3 years about various school events and billing questions. She probably thought I was Mason's mother. Dear Mrs. Patterson, I typed, please update the billing for Mason Hartwell's account to his parent, Emily Hartwell, immediately. I will no longer be covering tuition costs. Thank you, Christina Hartwell. I read it over twice, then hit send before I could second-guess myself. 3 actions. 3 cuts to the financial umbilical cord that had been sustaining my family for 6 years. All before 9 in the morning, before I'd even gotten dressed for work. Now came the hard part. I opened the family group chat, usually full of Mum's forwarded recipes, and Dad's political memes and Emily's requests for babysitting or money. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What I said here mattered. I typed carefully. Hi everyone. I've removed my payment information from all family accounts and expenses, effective end of this billing cycle. I need space and respect. Please do not contact me for 72 hours. Short, clear, non-negotiable. I read it 3 times, then pressed send before the guilt could stop me. The guilt came anyway, crashing over me like a wave. Was I being cruel? Was this petty revenge for a ruined dress? Was I punishing Mason for something that wasn't his fault? My mother's voice echoed in my head all the years of family takes care of family and we don't air our dirty laundry. But then I remembered the laughter. Dad's hearty chuckle at my humiliation. Mum's dismissal of the dress as inexpensive and therefore unimportant. Emily's complete lack of concern. 35 years of being the strong one, the capable one, the one who didn't need the things other people needed. Setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was survival. I'd given them countless chances to see me, to value me. They'd chosen not to. Over and over, they'd chosen not to. I turned off my phone notifications, silencing the inevitable responses, and got ready for work. The office felt different that morning, though nothing had actually changed. Same grey cubicles, same fluorescent lighting, same background hum of keyboards. But I felt different. Lighter. Like I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for so long, I'd stopped noticing the weight, and now it was gone, and I could stand up straight. My colleague Jenna stopped by my desk around 11, with coffee from the good shop down the street. "You seem different today," she said, setting the cup down. "Good different. What happened?" Jenna was the closest thing I had to a best friend at work. We'd started the same week 5 years ago, suffered through the same brutal clients. She knew my family was complicated, though I'd never gone into details. I finally said no, I told her. She waited for me to elaborate. When I didn't, she just nodded. "About damn time. You give too much." We had lunch at the Thai place we both loved, and she talked about her weekend and her boyfriend troubles. Normal things, easy things that had nothing to do with my family or my decision or the guilt still churning in my stomach. It felt good to be someone's friend rather than someone's ATM. At 3 o'clock, during a brief lull between meetings, I made the mistake of turning my phone back on. The screen came alive with notifications. They started loading immediately, one after another, a cascading waterfall of messages and missed calls and voicemails. The numbers kept climbing: 47 missed calls, 89 text messages, 12 voicemails. My phone actually froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer volume. I stared at the screen, watching the notifications continue to populate. Mum's name appeared dozens of times, Dad's almost as many. Emily had called 18 times. Even Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan, who I barely spoke to outside of holidays, had left messages. My first instinct was to open them to see what was so urgent, to fix whatever problem I'd apparently created. But I stopped myself. I'd asked for 72 hours. It had been 6. If this was a true emergency, someone would have called 911, not me. This wasn't an emergency. This was panic. This was my family realizing that the invisible support system they'd taken for granted was disappearing. I silenced my phone again and went back to work. But I couldn't stop thinking about those notifications. That wall of messages, all of them demanding my attention, my explanation, my compliance. By the time I left work at 5:30, the notification count on my phone had climbed even higher. I'd kept it on silent all afternoon, but I could see the screen lighting up periodically in my bag, constant vibrations against my laptop. It was like carrying a small, angry animal trying to get my attention. I made it home, dead-bolted my apartment door, and finally, with a glass of wine in hand and my heart pounding, opened my messages. Mum's texts had started mild and escalated to frantic. The first one sent at 9:42. "Christina, honey, Netflix isn't working. Did something happen with the account?" Then an hour later, the Disney Plus isn't working either. "Can you check your credit card?" By noon, the tone had shifted. "Christina, what did you do? Netflix says payment failed." Then, 20 minutes later, "I just got off the phone with the insurance company. They said you removed us from coverage. Your father has a doctor appointment Wednesday. What are we supposed to do?" The final text from Mum sent at 4:15. "Call me now. This is not funny. We have bills. We have responsibilities. You can't just cut us off like this." I took a long sip of wine and moved to Dad's voicemail. His voice boomed through the speaker, tight with anger. "Young lady, I don't know what kind of tantrum this is, but family doesn't abandon family over a dress. You're being selfish and immature. We raised you better than this. I need you to call me back before 6 p.m, or I'm driving to your apartment and we're going to have a conversation face to face." The message had been left at 2:30. It was now 5:45. I had 15 minutes before Dad might actually show up. Emily's texts were the most numerous and varied in tone. They'd started with confusion, morphed into anger, ended with emotional manipulation. "Are you serious right now?" was the first one. "You're really going to do this because of what happened at dinner?" Then an hour later, Mason's school just called me. They said you told them to bill me for tuition. "Christina, I can't afford that right now. You know the spa is struggling. Why are you doing this?" By mid-afternoon, Emily had shifted tactics. "You're punishing a child because you can't take a joke. Mason is going to get kicked out of school because his aunt decided to have a meltdown over a dress." The final message from Emily. "Mom is crying. Dad's blood pressure is up. Mason's school called about tuition. Is this what you wanted? To hurt us? I thought you were better than this, Christina." I set the phone down and pressed my palms against my eyes. The guilt was overwhelming. Mom crying, Dad's blood pressure, Mason potentially getting kicked out of school. Was I really willing to cause all this pain? But then I remembered the spreadsheet. The 94 for what I'd spent over 6 years, the mortgage that had destroyed my credit. This wasn't about a dress. This had never been about a dress. My email pinged. It was from Mrs. Patterson Mason's school administrator. "Dear Ms. Hartwell, thank you for your email. I've updated our billing records to reflect Emily Hartwell as the primary account holder. However, I wanted to bring to your attention that there is currently an outstanding balance of $2,400 for the months of September, October, and November. The automatic payment from your account covered these months, but we had not received the expected payments from the family prior to your auto-pay setup. Could you please advise on a payment plan?" I read the email 3 times. Emily hadn't paid tuition for 3 months. September, October, November. She'd simply stopped paying and let my automatic payment cover it. She'd known I was paying. She'd counted on it, and she'd never said a word. I pulled up my bank statements. There they were. August, $800 from Emily's account, then nothing from her for 3 months. But the school had been paid because my automatic payment had kicked in quietly, covering the gap Emily had left. She hadn't just been letting me pay for Mason's education. She'd been actively avoiding her own responsibility, knowing I'd catch her when she fell. And now, she had the audacity to text me about punishing a child when she was the one who'd failed to pay for 3 months. The rage that surged through me was cleaner and hotter than anything I'd felt before. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was calculated exploitation. My doorbell rang sharp and insistent. Then again, and again. Someone was leaning on it, holding the button down. I pulled up the security camera app on my phone, hand shaking. The screen showed my building's entrance. Emily stood there, face blotchy and red mascara streaking down her cheeks. She wasn't just crying. She was sobbing, her whole body heaving. As I watched, she stopped ringing the bell and started pounding on the door with her fist. My phone buzzed with a new text. "Emily, I know you're in there. I can see your car in the parking lot. Open the door. We need to talk about this." I stared at the screen at my sister, falling apart on my doorstep, and felt absolutely nothing. No sympathy, no urge to fix this. Just cold certainty that opening that door would mean surrendering everything I'd just fought to establish. Another text from Emily. "Please, Christina, I'm begging you. Mason is scared. He thinks you hate him. Mum won't stop crying. Please, just open the door and we can talk like adults." I typed a response. "Emily, I asked for 72 hours of no contact. It's been less than 12. I'm not opening the door. Go home." I watched through the camera as she read the message, saw her face crumple, watched her pound on the door one more time harder. Then she pulled out her phone and called me. The phone in my hand started buzzing. I declined the call. She called again immediately. I declined again. A third time, a fourth. Finally, she stopped. She stood there for another minute, staring at the door's shoulders shaking. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve turned and walked back to her car. I watched until she drove away. The silence in my apartment was deafening. I sat down on my couch, still holding my phone. My sister had just sobbed on my doorstep, and I'd refused to let her in. My father had threatened to come here. My mother was crying, my nephew was scared, and all I felt was tired, so profoundly tired. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Dad. "Since you won't answer your phone like a reasonable adult, I'm coming over there tonight. We're going to settle this." I looked at the time. 6:15. If he'd left right after that message, he'd be here in 20 minutes. I stood up, walked to my bedroom and started packing an overnight bag. I wasn't going to be here when he arrived. I'd asked for 72 hours, and I was going to take them even if it meant spending the night in a hotel. As I zipped the bag closed, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. I looked different, harder maybe, or maybe just finally visible, even if only to myself. I grabbed my keys, turned off all the lights to make the apartment look empty, and headed for the door. Whatever happened next, it would happen on my terms, not theirs. I was 3 steps from my apartment door when I heard footsteps pounding up the stairwell. I'd assumed Emily had left driven away like the security camera showed, but apparently she'd only moved her car and circled back. The doorknob turned before I could reach it. I'd unlocked the deadbolt to leave, and Emily must have tried it on a hunch. The door swung open and she burst through, her face still blotchy and tear-streaked, but now twisted with something harder than desperation. "Do you have any idea what you just did to us?" she shouted, her voice cracking. She saw my overnight bag and her eyes narrowed. "Were you seriously about to run away? Are you really that much of a coward?" I dropped the bag and crossed my arms, forcing myself to stay calm even as my heart hammered. "I stopped letting you use me. That's what I did." "Use you?" Emily's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You think we were using you? We're family, Christina. Family helps each other. But you wouldn't understand that because you've always been so self-sufficient, so proud of not needing anyone." "I paid $94,000 over 6 years. I interrupted, my voice low and steady. "I co-signed a mortgage that destroyed my credit score. I covered 3 months of Mason's tuition that you didn't bother paying. Don't you dare talk to me about family." Emily's face went from red to white. "How did you—" She stopped herself, shook her head violently. "Those were loans. We were going to pay you back. We just needed time. Loans require asking permission and discussing terms. What you did was theft by assumption. God, listen to yourself." Emily was pacing now, her hands gesturing wildly. "Theft? Really? I'm your sister. Mason is your nephew. We're not criminals. We're people who needed help, and you had the means to give it. Was it really so terrible that we leaned on you? You didn't lean. You collapsed your entire weight onto me and expected me to hold it forever without complaint." I picked up my bag again. "And now, I'm done. You need to leave." But Emily wasn't leaving. She was crying again, harder now, her words tumbling out between sobs. "You don't understand. The spa is $15,000 in debt. I've been using credit cards to pay rent. James thinks everything is fine. He thinks the business is breaking even. I can't tell him the truth. He'll leave me. And Mason's school is so expensive, but it's good for him. He's thriving there, and I just needed a little more time to figure it out." "So you made me figure it out for you," I said, without asking, without telling me what you were doing. "Because I knew you'd say yes," Emily shouted. "You always say yes. You're the responsible one, the one with money, the one who has her life together. Was it really so wrong to count on that yes?" I said simply. "It was wrong." Emily stared at me, her face crumpling. Then something shifted in her expression, and the words came out in a rush like she couldn't hold them back anymore. "That party was supposed to fix this. Mum and Dad were going to mention they're behind on the mortgage, just casually bring it up, and you were supposed to offer to help, like you always do, but then budgeting and the dress and everything got ruined." She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realised what she'd just said. The room went very quiet. I could hear the hum of my refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside my own breathing. "The party was a setup," I said slowly. "You invited me to dinner specifically to manipulate me into giving you money." Emily's silence was answer enough. "And when Mason destroyed my dignity in front of everyone, when you all laughed and dismissed it, you weren't defending me because you still needed me compliant. You couldn't risk me being angry enough to say no when you finally asked for what you wanted. And Christina, it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" My voice was still calm, but I could feel something dangerous underneath it, something that had been compressed for too long and was finally expanding. "Explain to me how it was different from exactly what I just described." Emily opened her mouth closed. It tried again. "We were desperate. Mum and Dad are really behind on payments. We thought if we could just talk to you in person, if you could see how much we needed. There's more, I don't know, isn't there?" I cut her off. "About the mortgage, about what I actually signed." Emily's face went completely pale. All the blood drained from me in an instant, leaving her looking almost grey under my apartment lights. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "How much do you know about the refinance?" Emily's whispered question hung in the air between us like smoke. How much did I know about the refinance? The fact that she was asking meant there was more to know. More they'd hidden, more lies stacked on top of the foundation of manipulation I'd already uncovered. "I know I'm a co-signer on a $180,000 mortgage," I said, watching her face carefully. "I know my credit score dropped from 780 to 650 because of late payments. I know I'm fully liable if Mum and Dad default. What I don't know is why you look like you're about to throw up." Emily sank into my couch without asking permission, her legs seemingly unable to hold her anymore. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice hollow. "They said it was just temporary, just until Dad found another job." "What job? Dad's been working at the hardware store for years." "No." Emily looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "He lost his job in 2018. The good job, the one with the insurance and the retirement benefits. He was laid off and he didn't tell anyone except Mum for almost 6 months. He was too ashamed, too proud. He kept leaving for work every morning and sitting in his car at the library parking lot applying for jobs on his phone." I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. 2018. That was 2 years before the refinance, Emily confirmed. By the time they needed to refinance, Dad had the hardware store job, but it paid half what he used to make. They'd been living on credit cards trying to keep up appearances. When the refinance came due, the bank pulled their credit report and saw all that debt. They were denied. So they used me. The pieces were clicking into place with horrible clarity. They told me it was just a formality, that the bank needed an extra signature for processing. "They needed your credit score?" Emily interrupted. "Your perfect 780 that you'd built up by being responsible and careful and never asking for help. That's what got them approved, not their income, not their payment history. You. And you knew this?" I wasn't asking. I was stating fact. Emily nodded miserably. "I was still living at home in 2020. I heard them talking about it. I heard Dad on the phone with the bank, heard him tell Mum they'd been denied. I heard them decide to ask you, and I heard them plan what to say to make it sound like no big deal. Why didn't you warn me?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "Why didn't you tell me what they were really asking?" Emily's laugh was bitter and broken. "Because if you co-signed they didn't need me to, don't you understand? My credit was worse than theirs. I had $23,000 in credit card debt from when my first business failed. The juice bar, remember? The one that lasted 8 months before I had to close it. I maxed out 3 credit cards trying to keep it afloat. If you hadn't co-signed, they would have come to me next, and I couldn't take on that responsibility. I was barely keeping my own head above water." The systematic exclusion suddenly made perfect sense. Emily got emotional support because she was the one who needed it, who asked for it, who made her struggles visible. I got financial obligation because I was the one who could handle it. who never complained, who made my stability look effortless. They'd made me the responsible one, so they didn't have to be. So Emily didn't have to be. You sacrificed me to save yourself, I said quietly. I know. Emily's voice cracked. I know that's what I did. And I felt guilty about it every day since, but not guilty enough to tell you the truth, because telling you would mean admitting what kind of person I am, and I couldn't face that. How bad is it now? I asked. The mortgage, how far behind are they? Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand. 2 months. $3,400. The bank sent a warning letter 3 weeks ago. That's why Mum and Dad organised the dinner. They were going to bring it up casually, make it sound like a temporary cash flow problem, ask if you could help them catch up just this once. They were going to promise to pay you back by Christmas. A promise they had no ability to keep. Probably not, Emily admitted. But they were desperate, and they knew you'd say yes because you always say yes, because you're Christina, the responsible one, the one who fixes things. And when Mason ripped my dress and you all laughed, you weren't defending me because you still needed me cooperative. The full picture was clear now. You couldn't risk me being too angry to help when they finally asked. It wasn't... Emily started, then stopped. Yes, that's exactly what it was. We needed you compliant. We needed you to be the Christina who doesn't make waves, who doesn't demand explanations, who just helps when she's needed. And when Mason did that, when everyone laughed, I should have stopped them. I should have defended you, but I was thinking about the mortgage and the tuition and my debt, and I let it happen. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. Emily sat on my couch looking small and defeated. I stood by the door with my overnight bag looking at my sister and seeing a stranger. Someone who'd known I was being deceived and said nothing. Someone who'd watched me be humiliated and done nothing. Someone who'd counted on my silence and compliance and exhaustion. Get out, I said quietly. Emily's head snapped up. Christina, please, just listen. Get out of my apartment and tell Mum and Dad I'm calling my lawyer tomorrow. A lawyer. Emily stood up, panic flooding her face again. Christina, you can't. They could lose the house. Where would they live? They're in their 60s. They can't start over. They should have thought of that before they lied to me, before they used me, before they built their entire life on the foundation of my ignorance. I opened the door and held it. Get out. Please. Emily was crying again, openly sobbing now. Please, don't do this. I know we were wrong. I know we hurt you, but they're our parents. This will destroy them. Isn't there any part of you that still cares about this family? I cared about this family for 35 years. I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. I cared so much. I paid for everything and asked for nothing and accepted being invisible as the price of belonging. And you all took that care and weaponized it against me. So no, Emily, right now, there isn't any part of me that cares more about protecting them than protecting myself. Emily walked to the door, shoulders shaking, mascara running down her face in black streaks. She paused in the doorway and looked back at me one more time. I'm sorry, she whispered. For all of it, I'm so sorry. I know you are, I said, but sorry doesn't pay back $94,000. Sorry doesn't fix my credit score. Sorry doesn't undo the fact that you all conspired to trap me in debt I didn't understand. I closed the door before she could say anything else, locked the deadbolt, pressed my back against it and waited for my hands to stop shaking. Through the door I could hear Emily crying in the hallway. Then footsteps receding. Then silence. I looked at my overnight bag, still packed, still ready. But I didn't pick it up. I wasn't running anymore. Let Dad come if he wanted. Let them all come. I had the truth now, all of it. And tomorrow morning I was calling a lawyer. I didn't sleep Monday night. Dad never showed up, which meant Emily must have called him and told him what happened, told him I knew everything. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was disappointed I didn't get to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what I thought of his lies. Tuesday morning, I called in sick to work, for the first time in 3 years. Then I called Sarah Chen, a college friend who'd gone to law school and now practiced family law in the city. We'd stayed in loose touch over the year's Christmas cards and occasional lunches. When I explained what I needed, she cleared her afternoon schedule. Her office was in a converted brownstone downtown, all exposed brick and modern furniture. Sarah greeted me with a hug that lasted longer than usual. "You sounded stressed on the phone," she said, gesturing to the leather chairs across from her desk. "Tell me everything." So I did. The dress incident, the financial audit, Emily's confession, the mortgage trap, all of it. Sarah took notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with something close to anger. "Christina, what your family did with that mortgage refinance, getting you to co-sign under false pretenses that borders on fraud." "I'm not interested in pressing charges," I said quickly. "I just need to know my options, my rights." Sarah pulled the mortgage documents I'd brought and spread them across her desk. "You're listed as co-signer, which means you're 100% liable if the primary borrowers default. Removing your name isn't simple. It requires them to refinance without you, which would need bank approval based on their credit and income alone, or they'd need to pay off the loan entirely. Neither of which is possible. Given what you've told me, no, neither seems likely." Sarah leaned back. "So let's talk about options. Option A, you demand they refinance without you. They apply, probably get denied, we're back where we started. Option B, you negotiate for partial home ownership in exchange for staying on the mortgage. Essentially, you're buying your protection with equity. Option C, you do nothing. Hope they keep paying, accept the risk to your credit. Option D, if they default, you force a home sale through a partition lawsuit to recover your losses. Those are all terrible options." "Yes," Sarah agreed bluntly, "because your family put you in a terrible position. None of these outcomes are good, Christina." I pressed my palms against my eyes. There has to be something else, some way to protect myself without destroying them. "Why?" Sarah's question was gentle but pointed. "Why is it your job to protect them when they clearly haven't protected you?" I didn't have an answer. Sarah started gathering my documents when something slipped out and fell to the floor. A piece of paper I didn't recognize. She picked it up, eyebrows rising. "Is this your parents' will?" I took it from her confused. It must have been filed with the mortgage paperwork, something I'd grabbed without paying attention. It was a draft copy dated 2022 with final version written across the top in Dad's handwriting. I scanned the document and my blood ran cold. Upon the death of both parties, the primary residence located at 847 Maple Street shall transfer in full to Emily Rose Hartwell. Christina Marie Hartwell shall receive a lump sum payment of $10,000 from remaining liquid assets. The house I was co-signed on, the house worth probably $300,000, went entirely to Emily, and I got $10,000. "In 2018, I said slowly. Dad promised me that when they were gone, Emily and I would split everything 50-50. Mum was there. She nodded. She agreed. I held up the paper. This says Emily gets the house and I get $10,000. Sarah took the will and read it, her lips pressing into a thin line. And this is dated April 2022, 4 years after that conversation. I thought about Emily living at home in her 30s, Emily's failed businesses, Emily's son needing stability, because I'm the strong one, because I don't need it as much. Christina, I'm going to be very direct because we're friends and because you need to hear this. Sarah leaned forward. What you're describing is called financial enmeshment. It's emotional manipulation, where one family member is designated as the perpetual caretaker and resource provider. You were selected for this role young, probably because you were naturally responsible, and it became self-reinforcing. The more you gave, without asking for anything back, the more they expected it. You became the one we can use instead of the responsible one. So what do I do? You set hard boundaries now today, or this continues until your parents pass away and you're left holding their debt while Emily gets their assets. That's what happens if you do nothing. Sarah's expression softened slightly. I know this is your family. I know you love them. But love doesn't obligate you to financial martyrdom. If I force the issue now, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, if I demand they refinance or threaten to force a sale, what happens? Sarah didn't sugarcoat it. They'll likely lose the house. With their credit and the current market, they probably can't refinance. And if you force a partition sale, the legal fees alone would eat into the proceeds. They'd walk away with maybe enough for a down payment on something smaller. It would devastate them. But if I don't, then you stay trapped. Your credit remains damaged. You're liable for their debt until they pay off the mortgage or die. And when they do die based on that will, Emily gets everything and you get $10,000. That's your reward for 35 years of being the strong one. I stared out Sarah's window at the street below, watching people whose families probably weren't actively exploiting them. You're saying I have to choose between destroying them and destroying myself. No, Sarah said firmly. They made that choice when they lied to you, when they spent 6 years taking your money without acknowledgement, when they planned to manipulate you at that dinner. You're not destroying them, Christina. You're refusing to let them destroy you. There's a difference. I looked at the will again at my name next to that insulting $10,000 figure and felt something inside me harden into certainty. What's my first step? Sarah pulled out a fresh legal pad. We need to send them a formal demand letter. But first, I need to understand your goal. Do you want to maintain a relationship with your family, or are you prepared to burn it all down? I thought about Mason's giggle, Emily's knowing silence, Mum and Dad's carefully planned manipulation, the 35 years of being invisible. I want them to understand there are consequences, I said finally. I want my name off that mortgage. I want my credit protected. And I want them to know that the strong one just got a lot stronger. Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone preparing for battle. Then, let's get to work. Sarah and I arrived at my parents' house exactly at 2:00 on Friday afternoon, 2 weeks to the day after the dress incident. I told Mum via email that I'd meet with them once with my lawyer present to discuss the situation. She'd responded with 3 paragraphs about how bringing a lawyer to a family matter was hurtful and unnecessary, but she'd agreed to the meeting. I expected to see Mum, Dad, and probably Emily. What I didn't expect was to walk through the front door and find 8 people sitting in the living room. Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan occupied the couch. Grandma Ruth sat in Dad's recliner, her face stern and disapproving. Even James, Emily's husband, was there looking deeply uncomfortable in the corner. They'd all turned to look at us as we entered, and the expressions ranged from concerned to hostile. What is this? I asked, my hand tightening on my leather portfolio. It's an intervention, Mum said, standing from her chair. We thought if you heard from everyone, not just us, you'd understand how much you're hurting the family. I felt Sarah's hand briefly touch my elbow, a silent reminder to stay calm. I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Well, since everyone's here, I suppose we can have this conversation once, instead of multiple times. We sat in the remaining chairs near the door, Sarah placing her briefcase deliberately on the coffee table. The clicking of its latches echoed in the tense silence. Uncle Tom cleared his throat, taking his cue. Christina, sweetheart, I know you're upset about what happened at dinner, but family is forever. You can't abandon them over money. That's not how we were raised. I'm not abandoning anyone, I interrupted, pulling the printed spreadsheet from my portfolio. I'm stopping them from exploiting me. This is a record of every payment I've made for family expenses over the past 6 years, streaming services, health insurance, tuition, emergency loans, home repairs. The total is $94,420. I passed the spreadsheet to Uncle Tom. His eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. Aunt Susan leaned over to read her hand flying to her mouth. "Linda," she said, looking at my mother, "is this true? Christina paid for all of this?" Mum's face flushed. "She offered to help. We didn't ask her to. I added you to my health insurance because Dad said his company stopped offering coverage," I said flatly. "I paid for Mason's tuition because Emily told me she was between jobs and it was just temporary. I covered emergency expenses because you said you'd pay me back. I didn't offer. I was asked and I said yes because I thought that's what family did." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out the mortgage documents. Mr. Hartwell, I'm Sarah Chen, Christina's attorney. I'd like to direct everyone's attention to these refinance documents from March 2020. Christina's name appears here as co-signer on a $180,000 mortgage. She was told this was a formality. In fact, her credit score was used to secure approval after you were denied due to your debt-to-income ratio. She's now fully liable for this debt, and her credit score has dropped from 780 to 650 due to your recent late payments. The room went completely silent. Grandma Ruth's face, already stern, turned to stone as she looked at her son. "Robert," she said, her voice cold, "you told me Christina offered to help with the refinance. You said she was being controlling, that she wanted her name on your house so she could have a say in your decisions. You made her sound like the problem." Dad's face went red, then white. "Mum, that's not... She did agree to co-sign. Did you tell her what co-signing actually meant?" Grandma demanded. "Did you explain she'd be responsible for the full amount if you defaulted?" The silence was damning. Emily looked at the floor. Mum twisted her hands in her lap. "I didn't think so," Grandma said quietly. "I taught you better than this, Robert." I pulled out the final document. "You're currently 2 months behind on mortgage payments. The bank has sent warning letters. I'm here today to give you 3 options, and you have 60 days to choose." My voice was steady, each word measured. "Option 1, refinance the mortgage without me. Remove my name and my liability. Option 2, transfer 25% ownership of the house to me in exchange for my remaining on the loan. Option 3, sell the house and split the proceeds fairly among all parties who have financial stake in it. And if we don't choose," Dad's voice was tight, "after 60 days, if the mortgage remains delinquent and my name remains on it, I'll pursue legal action to force a partition sale to protect my credit and recover my losses." Dad shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the hardwood. "You'd make us homeless, your own parents homeless, because you're throwing a tantrum over a dress." I stood too, meeting his eyes. "You made me a financial hostage for years. You lied to me, used me, and planned to manipulate me into giving you more money at that dinner. I'm not throwing a tantrum. I'm giving you choices you never gave me. Choose wisely." The room erupted. Mum started crying, hing. Emily tried to speak. Uncle Tom attempted to mediate. But through it all, I stood there with Sarah beside me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally visible. Not as the strong one, not as the responsible one, not as the convenient one, just as someone who mattered enough to fight for herself. The first 2 weeks after the family meeting, I heard nothing directly from my parents or Emily. Radio silence. I returned to work, threw myself into a major client project, and tried to ignore the knot of anxiety that lived permanently in my stomach. Jenna took me out for drinks and told me I looked lighter, more present, even if I also looked exhausted. But I started getting texts from Aunt Susan. Little updates I hadn't asked for but was secretly grateful to receive. "Your mum sold her engagement ring to catch up on mortgage," one said. "Your dad is working extra shifts." Then a few days later, "Emily's spa is struggling. People are talking. I didn't respond to these messages, but I read everyone. The full story came out in pieces, assembled from Aunt Susan's updates, and a few uncomfortable conversations with Grandma Ruth, who called me once to say she was proud of me and ashamed of her son. Apparently, the party incident had been witnessed by several of Mom's friends from her book club. One of them, Christine Morrison, had been sitting 2 seats away when Mason ripped my dress. She'd watched the family laugh and dismiss it, watched me leave in tears and been disturbed enough to mention it in her private Facebook group for local mums. The story spread, not as gossip exactly, but as concern. Did you hear what happened to Linda's daughter? Turned into, did you know Emily's been letting her sister pay for everything? The spa's reputation suffered by association. Over 3 weeks, Emily received 8 cancellation calls. Her online reviews, previously glowing, started including phrases like unprofessional family situation and financial concerns. Her revenue dropped 30% in the first 2 weeks, then 40%. 40% by week 3. Meanwhile, my parents were drowning. The streaming services I'd paid for had lapsed. The health insurance I'd covered was gone, forcing them onto a high-deductible marketplace plan that ate into their budget. Utilities I'd apparently been subsidising without realising it, the internet, the water bill, suddenly were their responsibility. Dad, who'd been working part-time at the hardware store, picked up additional shifts. Mum sold her jewellery piece by piece, including her engagement ring from Dad, to cover the 2 months of delinquent mortgage payments. The house they'd taken such pride in, the one they'd built their whole identity around, now felt like a financial albatross. Aunt Susan told me Mum had said, "We're drowning in this place and I don't even enjoy being here anymore." Then there was Emily's marriage. James had always seemed like a good guy, steady and supportive, but he'd been kept in the dark about everything. The spa's debt, Emily's failure to pay Mason's tuition, the extent to which she'd been relying on me. When the credit card statement arrived showing a $4,200 the balance he didn't know existed, he confronted her. The fight that followed was loud enough that Mason told his teacher at school that his parents were having problems. Aunt Susan reported James's words secondhand. "Why didn't you tell me? I would have helped. Instead, you used your sister until she broke. What kind of person does that?" It wasn't the debt that hurt James. It was the lies, the manipulation, the discovery that his wife was capable of systematically exploiting her own family. The extended family split down the middle. Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan sided with me, as did Grandma Ruth. But Dad's brother, Uncle Mike, called me heartless. Cousin Jennifer posted something vague on social media about family loyalty that everyone knew was directed at me. Mum's best friend Patricia stopped speaking to me entirely. Mum stopped going to church, unable to face the questions and the knowing looks. Dad's poker night became unbearable after one of the guys made a comment about being careful about co-signing anything for family. He stopped going. Their social life, so active before, contracted to nearly nothing. The family shame was public, now spreading through their community like water through cracks in concrete. I tried not to think about it, tried to focus on work, on my own life, on the fact that I'd done the right thing. But guilt gnawed at me constantly. Had I gone too far? Was I punishing them beyond what they deserved? At night, lying in bed, I'd run through the numbers again and again, reassuring myself that I'd been exploited, that my response was proportionate. But doubt crept in anyway. On day 20 of the 60-day deadline, I was getting ready for bed when my phone rang at 11 p.m. Emily's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it, my first instinct to decline. She'd tried calling twice since the family meeting, and I'd ignored both attempts. But something about the lateness of the hour made me pause. I answered. "Christina." Emily's voice was shaking raw with panic. "Dad's in the emergency room. Mom thinks it's his heart. She's hysterical. I don't know what to do. Please, come." My stomach dropped. What happened? He collapsed, just fell over in the living room. "The ambulance is here now. They're taking him to St. Catherine's." Christina, please. I know you're angry. I know we don't deserve your help, but please. I was already grabbing my keys, my hands moving, before my brain had fully processed the decision. I'm on my way. I hung up and stood in my apartment, keys in hand, overnight bag still unpacked from weeks ago in the corner where I'd left it. Was this real? Or was this another manipulation, another crisis manufactured to break my resolve? But what if it wasn't? What if Dad was actually dying and I wasn't there because I'd assumed the worst? I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, my heart pounding everything I'd built over the past week, suddenly feeling very fragile. Dad survived. It was angina, not a full heart attack, but serious enough that the doctor had used words like warning sign and lifestyle changes and stress management. I'd stayed at the hospital until 3 a.m, sitting in the waiting room with my family, but not speaking to them, leaving once I knew Dad was stable and admitted for observation. I went back to work the next day and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking every time my phone rang. The guilt was worse now, a physical weight pressing on my chest. What if the next call was worse? What if my ultimatum actually killed him? A week after the hospital scare, I was reviewing spreadsheets in my office when my desk phone rang. Christina, there's a little boy in the lobby asking for you, the receptionist said, her voice uncertain. He says his name is Mason. He's with his mother in the car outside, but he came in alone. My heart did something complicated. I'll be right down. Mason stood in the marble lobby looking small and nervous, clutching a piece of paper rolled up in his hands. He was wearing his school uniform, and his backpack was almost as big as he was. When he saw me step out of the elevator, his face lit up with relief and fear in equal measure. Hi, Auntie Christina, he said, his voice small. I knelt down to his level, my throat tight. Hi, buddy. What are you doing here? He held out the rolled paper. I made this for you. I unrolled it carefully. It was a crayon drawing, the kind 8-year-olds make, with figures that are more stick than person, but somehow still convey emotion. The title at the top in careful block letters read, I'm sorry. The picture showed what was clearly meant to be our family, Mum, Dad, Emily, Mason, and me. But Christina was drawn noticeably bigger than everyone else, and above her head were the words, strongest person I know, in red crayon with hearts around it. Mason, I whispered, this is beautiful. I'm sorry I ripped your dress. He said the words coming out in a rush like he'd been practicing. Mommy said you wouldn't be mad because you're tough, but I see now that was wrong. Everyone has feelings, even tough people. I should have been more careful. I'm really, really sorry. The apology was clearly rehearsed, probably coached by Emily, word for word. But the drawing looked genuine. The way he'd made me bigger, stronger, important. The way he was looking at me now with those wide eyes that saw me as someone who mattered. Thank you, I said, pulling him into a hug. I forgive you. He hugged me back, his small arms wrapping around my neck, and for a moment everything else fell away. This was just my nephew, the kid I'd paid tuition for, the kid I'd watched grow up, the kid I still loved despite everything. But then he pulled back and said without thinking, without the careful rehearsal, Mommy told me you don't care about fancy clothes because you're rich and strong. She said you wouldn't yell at me like you would at other kids. So it was okay to pull the bow to be funny, because you wouldn't mind. He realised immediately he had said something wrong. His eyes went wide, his hand flying to his mouth. I wasn't supposed to say that part. The anger that flared in my chest wasn't directed at Mason. He was 8. He'd been taught that some people's feelings mattered less than others, that being strong meant being available for mistreatment. He'd been coached not just in that moment at the party, but probably for years to see me as someone who existed to absorb whatever the family needed to throw at her. But Mason himself wasn't malicious. Looking at his frightened face, at the drawing he'd made with care, at the genuine remorse in his eyes, I could see that he understood now. He understood he'd hurt me. He just hadn't understood it before because the adults in his life had taught him not to. Mason, look at me, I said gently. You didn't do anything wrong by telling me that. Your mum was wrong to tell you those things. I do care about my clothes. I do have feelings that can get hurt. Being strong doesn't mean being okay with people treating me badly. Do you understand? He nodded slowly. I think so. Like how I'm good at soccer, but I still don't like it when kids push me during games. Exactly like that. I'm sorry, he said again, and this time it sounded less rehearsed and more real. I'm sorry I believed Mommy when she said it was okay. I hugged him again this time, feeling the tears prick at my eyes. I forgive you, buddy. But your mum needs to learn something important about respecting everyone's feelings, even the strong ones. We walked toward the lobby doors together, his small hand in mine. I could see Emily's car through the glass, could see her sitting in the driver's seat, not getting out too ashamed to face me, but using her son as an ambassador. As we reached the door, Mason stopped and looked up at me. His voice dropped to a whisper, and I had to lean down to hear him. Are you going to make Grandma and Grandpa lose their house? Mummy cries about it every night. She says I might have to change schools because we can't afford it anymore. She says it's all going to fall apart, and it's because of what I did with your dress. My heart clenched so hard, I actually gasped. I looked down at this child, this innocent child, who was carrying the weight of adult consequences, who thought his moment of thoughtlessness had destroyed his entire family. Mason, listen to me very carefully, I said, kneeling again. Nothing that's happening is because of you, not one single thing. This is about grown-ups making bad choices for a very long time. You ripping my dress didn't cause any of this. Do you understand? But if I hadn't done it, you wouldn't be mad at everyone. I'm not about the dress, honey. I'm hurt about how everyone treated me after, and I'm dealing with the problems that started long before that night. None of this is your fault. But as I said it, watching him try to process it, watching the confusion and fear in his 8-year-old eyes, I felt the full weight of what I was doing, not just to my parents or to Emily, but to this child who loved his grandparents, who was happy in his school, whose world was falling apart while I held firm to my boundaries. Was I right to do this, or was I just punishing Mason for the sins of his mother and grandparents? Go to your mum, I said, my voice thick. She's waiting for you. He hugged me one more time, then ran out to the car. I watched him climb into the back seat, watched Emily finally look up and meet my eyes through the windshield. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then she drove away. I stood there in the lobby holding Mason's drawing, and for the first time since this all started, I genuinely didn't know if I was doing the right thing anymore. I kept Mason's drawing in my desk drawer at work. Some days I'd pull it out and stare at it, at the way he'd made me bigger than everyone else at those words, strongest person I know, in his careful 8-year-old handwriting. It didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel like a monster. But I didn't call my family. And I didn't rescind the ultimatum. On day 30, exactly at the halfway point of the 60-day deadline, Sarah sent the formal follow-up letter via certified mail. I'd read the draft 3 times before approving it, my stomach churning at the legal language that made everything feel so final. Client requires resolution per options stated refinance, ownership transfer or home sale. Failure to comply will result in legal action to partition property and protect client's credit from ongoing default risk. That same week, my co-worker Jenna stopped by my desk with her phone in her hand and an uncomfortable expression. I need to show you something, she said. My sister-in-law shared it in her mum group. I think it's about you. She turned the phone to show me a GoFundMe campaign. The title read, Single Mum Fighting Financial Hardship After Family Estrangement. Emily's photo smiled from the page, Mason beside her looking tall and small. The description painted a picture of a struggling mother whose wealthy sister had cut off all support over a minor incident at a family dinner, leaving them unable to afford basic necessities. It mentioned the dress incident but framed it as an innocent accident that I'd blown out of proportion. There was no mention of the mortgage, the $94,000. The lies, the manipulation. Just poor Emily abandoned by her cold-hearted sister. The campaign had raised $400 in 3 days. Jesus, I breathed. I'm sorry, Jenna said, but I thought you should know. I took screenshots of everything, then pulled up my own documentation. The mortgage papers, the spreadsheets, the text messages where Emily confessed the party was a setup. I reported the campaign to GoFundMe's fraud department with a detailed explanation and every piece of evidence I had. 5 days later, the campaign disappeared. GoFundMe sent Emily a notice that her campaign had been removed for misrepresentation. The $400 was refunded to donors who then started asking Emily why the campaign had been taken down, what she'd lied about. The embarrassment must have been excruciating. Part of me felt satisfied. Part of me felt sick. Then, on day 32, Mum called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Christina. Her voice was thick with tears. Please, we've tried everything. 4 banks have denied our refinance application. We don't have the money to add you to the deed. Sarah didn't explain the tax implications. It would cost us thousands we don't have. Please, don't force us to sell. We'll lose so much money in this market. Where would we live? We've been in this house for 30 years. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone. Mum, I didn't create this situation. You did. You and Dad, when you lied to me about what I was signing. We were desperate, she sobbed. Your father lost his job. We didn't know what to do. We made mistakes, but does that mean we deserve to lose everything? I don't know. I said honestly. Maybe not, but I don't deserve to lose my credit and my financial security because you decided I was the one who could handle being lied to. Please, just give us more time. You have 30 days. That was the agreement. Christina, your father is so stressed. The doctor said another incident like last time could be serious. You're killing him. The words hit like a slap. That's not fair. None of this is fair. Mum's voice cracked. You have money. You have a good job. You don't have children depending on you. We have nothing. Don't you care about that at all? I cared for 35 years. I said, my voice breaking. I cared so much, I paid for everything and asked for nothing and let you treat me like I didn't matter. And you took that care and built your entire life on it without ever once saying thank you. So, no, Mum, right now I don't care about your comfort more than I care about my survival. I hung up before she could respond, sat at my desk, shaking fighting tears, wondering if I was really the villain in this story after all. That night I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a text. Dad's name appeared on the screen. We hadn't communicated directly since before the family meeting. The message was short. Hospital again, real heart attack this time. Come if you still care about family. I stared at the words, my hands going numb. Real heart attack this time. Was it real? Or was this another manipulation, another crisis designed to break my resolve? After the angina scare, after Mason's visit, after Mum's tearful phone call. Was this the final play to make me cave? But what if it was real? What if Dad was dying right now and I was standing in my kitchen, analysing whether his heart attack was genuine enough to warrant my presence? I grabbed my keys for the second time in a month and headed for the door, my heart pounding, Mason's drawing still in my bag, everything I'd fought for hanging in the balance. The drive to St. Catherine's Hospital felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. My mind kept cycling through possibilities. Real heart attack. Manipulation. Real heart attack. Manipulation. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, I'd convinced myself of both outcomes simultaneously. I found them in the cardiac wing 3rd floor. Mum sat in a plastic chair outside Dad's room, her face blotchy and aged in a way I'd never seen before. She looked up when my footsteps approached and something in her expression crumbled. He's stable, she said before I could ask. It wasn't a full heart attack, severe angina again, but The doctor said this is a serious warning. Next time might not be a warning. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Through the window of Dad's room, I could see him lying in the hospital bed, oxygen tube in his nose monitors beeping steadily. He looked small, diminished, not like the father who'd yelled at me in the living room a month ago. Emily sat in the corner of the waiting area, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't look at me when I walked past. The doctor said stress is the major factor, Mum continued, her voice hollow. His cholesterol is high, his blood pressure is high, but the stress is what's triggering the episodes. He needs lifestyle changes, medication, rest. She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. He needs his daughter to stop threatening to take away his home. I'd expected that. The guilt trip wrapped in medical necessity. But before I could respond, Mum's face crumpled and she started crying in a way that felt different from her usual tears. These weren't performative sobs designed to manipulate. These were the broken sounds of someone coming apart. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "Christina, I'm so sorry. I didn't realise. I didn't see how badly we'd hurt you. I thought you were strong enough to handle everything. I thought being strong meant you didn't need the things other people needed. I was so wrong." I stood frozen, not knowing what to do with this, with Mum's actual genuine remorse. "Come with me," she said, standing abruptly. She walked down the hallway to an empty consultation room and I followed. Once inside with the door closed, Mum sank into one of the chairs and looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I need to tell you something I've never told you before, about why I am the way I am." I sat down, slowly wary but listening. "I was the middle child," Mum said, "between your Aunt Rachel, who was brilliant and beautiful, and Uncle David, who was the baby everyone doted on. I was invisible, completely invisible. My parents went to Rachel's every recital, every award ceremony. They spoiled David because he was the youngest. And me, I was just there, taking care of myself, expected to be fine on my own." I'd never heard this before. In all my 35 years, Mum had never talked about her childhood beyond surface-level anecdotes. "When I had you girls," she continued, "I swore I would do better. I swore I would pay attention to the one who needed it most. I saw Emily struggling with school, with confidence, with everything, and I remembered being the forgotten one. So I gave her everything I never got. Every bit of attention, every bit of support. And you forgot I needed it too," I said quietly. Mum nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't forget. I just thought you were like Rachel, strong, capable, someone who would be fine without constant attention. I thought I was being fair by giving to the one who needed more. But I was just repeating the same pattern, wasn't I? I made you feel invisible the way my parents made me feel invisible." The anger I'd been carrying for weeks cracked open, revealing something underneath that looked dangerously like empathy. Mum hadn't set out to hurt me. She'd been trying to heal her own wounds through her parenting and ended up inflicting the same wounds on me. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" I asked, because admitting it would mean admitting I failed you, that I became my mother even though I swore I never would. Mum reached for my hand and I let her take it. "Christina, you are breaking. I can see it. And it's my fault. I taught you that being strong meant not needing anyone, and then I punished you for being exactly what I made you." We sat in silence for a long moment, the hospital sounds muffled through the door. I thought about patterns repeating across generations, about Mum feeling invisible and making me feel invisible, about how damage gets passed down in families like genetic code. "I can't just forgive everything because you explained it," I finally said. "Understanding why doesn't erase what happened." "I know, I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for a chance to do better, to see you instead of expecting you to be invisible." I pulled my hand back and stood up. "I'll pause the legal action for 30 more days, but only if you agree to family therapy. Real therapy, not just a performance to manipulate me into backing down. And you and Dad need to make the mortgage payments on time. I'll monitor the account. Miss one payment and the pause ends. Mum nodded frantically. Yes, anything, thank you. And Mum, one more thing. Strong doesn't mean invulnerable. It never did. You need to stop using that word as an excuse to neglect me. I will, I promise. I left the consultation room exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. As I walked back toward the waiting area, Emily stood up from her corner chair. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her phone. Christina, she said hesitantly, can we talk? Alone. There's something I need to tell you about why I've been this way. About why I've treated you the way I have. I looked at her, at my sister, who'd known the truth about the mortgage and said nothing, who'd coached her son to disrespect me, who'd created a fraudulent fundraiser to paint me as the villain. Part of me wanted to walk away. But the other part, the part that had just heard Mum's confession, wondered if understanding Emily's damage might matter too. 5 minutes, I said. That's all you get. Emily's 5 minutes in the hospital hallway had turned into 20, and what she told me still echoed in my mind weeks later as we sat in Dr. Patel's office for our 4th therapy session. She'd confessed to feeling like a perpetual failure, always comparing herself to me, always coming up short. She'd admitted that making me the villain in her mind was easier than facing her own inadequacy. It hadn't been a complete explanation, and it certainly wasn't an excuse, but it had been honest, raw, real. That conversation, combined with Mum's confession and my own exhaustion, had led me to agree to family therapy. But I'd insisted on choosing the therapist myself. Dr. Patel came highly recommended, specialised in family systems and financial enmeshment, and had no connection to anyone in my family. I needed someone who wouldn't automatically side with the poor, struggling family over the cold, successful daughter. The first session had been excruciating. We'd sat in Dr. Patel's comfortable office with its soft lighting and abstract art, everyone perched on the edges of their seats like birds ready to fly away. Dr. Patel, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an air of unshakable calm, had laid out the ground rules with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Everyone gets uninterrupted speaking time. We focus on I feel statements, not accusations. No blaming. The goal here is understanding and repair, not winning or being right. This is a safe space, but safety requires honesty. Can everyone agree to these terms? We'd all nodded, though I'd seen Dad's jaw clench at the words, no blaming. My turn to speak came in the second session after Dr. Patel had spent the first meeting just establishing baseline histories and relationships. She'd asked me to share my experience of being in this family, and I'd felt every eye in the room turn to me. I felt invisible my entire life. I'd said my voice steadier than I'd expected. Every achievement I had was minimized or ignored. Every pain I felt was dismissed as not serious enough to warrant attention. I became your ATM because somewhere along the way, I thought that financial value might finally earn me emotional value. But it never did. I was useful, not cherished. And there's a difference. Mum had started crying quietly. Dad had stared at his hands, his jaw working, like he wanted to speak but couldn't. Emily had looked at the wall, her arms wrapped around herself. Can you give us an example? Dr. Patel had asked gently. So I told them about the broken arm at age 10, sitting with frozen peas for 6 hours while Emily got pampered for a cold. I told them about the laptop money taken for Emily's piano competition. I told them about my college graduation, about walking across that stage alone while they stayed home for Mason's mild fever. The third session was when Emily broke. Dr. Patel had been asking her about her relationship with me, about why she'd felt entitled to my financial support, and something in Emily just cracked open. I resented her, Emily had said, her voice thick with tears. My whole life I resented her. Christina was effortlessly smart. She got good grades without trying. She got scholarships and jobs and promotions, and I worked twice as hard for half the success. I felt like a failure every time I looked at her, and I think... She'd pause, swallowing hard. I think I sabotaged her to level the playing field. Every time Mum and Dad pitied me, every time they focused on my struggles instead of her successes, it felt like they loved me more, like I was winning at something even if it was just being broken. I'd sat there stunned. Part of me had suspected something like this, but hearing Emily admit it out loud was different. It didn't excuse anything, but it helped me understand that Emily's cruelty hadn't been about me at all. It had been about her own sense of inadequacy. Christina, Dr. Patel, had asked, "How does it feel to hear that?" Sad. I'd answered honestly. Sad that we spent our whole lives competing for crumbs of attention instead of just both being loved. Now, in the 4th session, it was Dad's turn. He'd been quiet through most of the previous meetings, answering questions when asked but never volunteering anything. Dr. Patel had been gently pushing him to share more, and today she'd asked him directly about his relationship with emotional expression. "My father taught me that emotions are weakness," Dad had said finally, his voice gruff. "Real men don't cry. Real men don't need reassurance. Real men provide and protect, and that's how they show love. I see now that I taught my daughters the same thing, even though they're not men and shouldn't have had to learn that at all." He'd looked at me, then really looked at me for the first time in weeks. "Christina, you were so capable. From the time you were small, you just figured things out. You didn't cry when you were hurt. You didn't ask for help. I thought that meant you didn't need verbal praise or affection or any of the soft things your mother gave Emily. I thought providing for you was enough. I'm learning now that it wasn't. That was emotional neglect, and I don't know how to fix its 35 years of it. It wasn't absolution. It didn't erase the debt or the lies or the manipulation, but it was acknowledgement. Dad had finally seen what he'd done, even if he didn't know how to undo it." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that admission hanging in the air. Then Dr. Patel turned to me, her expression serious. "Christina, we've heard from your mother, your father, and your sister about their perspectives and their failings. Now, I need to ask you something important." She leaned forward slightly. "What do you need to feel like part of this family again? Not what they need from you. What do you need from them?" The room went completely silent. Mum held her breath. Dad's hands gripped the arms of his chair. Emily stared at me with wide, anxious eyes, and I realised I didn't have an answer ready. I'd been so focused on protecting myself, on establishing boundaries, on making them understand what they had done, that I hadn't actually thought about what repair would look like. I started, then stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I need to think about that." "That's fair," Dr. Patel said. "This is your homework for next week. I want you to make a list of what you need. Not what you think is reasonable to ask for. Not what will make them comfortable. What you actually need to feel safe and valued in this family. Can you do that?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Good, because Christina hears what I want you to understand." Dr. Patel's voice was gentle but firm. "You've spent 35 years meeting everyone else's needs. It's time for you to identify your own, and it's time for your family to learn that meeting those needs is not optional. It's the price of having you in their lives." I spent the entire week writing and rewriting my list. Every time I added something, my brain would immediately counter with, "That's too much," or "They'll never agree to that," or "You're being unreasonable." I'd have to stop, close my eyes, and remember Dr. Patel's words. What do you actually need? Not what's convenient for them. What you need. By the time I walked into the 5th therapy session, I had 3 pages of handwritten notes that I'd condensed into 5 core boundaries. My hands shook as I sat down, the folded paper burning a hole in my pocket. Dr. Patel gave me an encouraging nod. Christina, would you like to share what you came up with? I pulled out the paper, smoothed it on my lap, and took a breath. I made a list of what I need. Some of these might sound harsh, but I'm trying to be honest. That's exactly what we need, Dr. Patel said. Go ahead. I read from my prepared notes, my voice gaining strength as I went. 1, I need financial contributions to be asked for explicitly, with clear terms and written agreements. Never assumed, implied, never presented as just a formality. If you need money, ask me directly and give me the option to say no without guilt. Mum nodded immediately. Dad shifted in his seat, but didn't interrupt. 2, I need my achievements celebrated with the same energy and attention given to Emily's. That means attending important events, asking about my work, remembering my milestones. I need to be seen, not just when you need something, but when I accomplish something. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. 3, I need Mason taught that apologies require changed behaviour. Saying sorry isn't enough. He needs to learn that everyone deserves respect, including the people labelled as strong or tough. I don't want him growing up thinking some people's feelings matter less than others. Absolutely, Emily whispered. 4, I need written agreements for any future financial assistance I choose to give. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need clear boundaries to protect myself. And 5, I need apologies to be followed by consistent action, not just words. I need to see the change over time before I can fully trust again. I folded the paper and looked up. The room was quiet. Mum was crying softly. Dad's expression was pained but understanding. Emily stared at her hands. Those are my needs, I finished. Non-negotiable. Dr. Patel turned to the rest of the family. How do we feel about what Christina shared? Dad spoke first. I think we can do all of that. I want to do all of that. He looked directly at me. I'd like to propose monthly calls, just you and me, where we talk openly about finances, where I tell you honestly how we're doing, what challenges we're facing, and I don't hide things or expect you to solve them. Transparency. I nodded slowly. I'd like that. Mum leaned forward. Christina, I've already started keeping a calendar of your work milestones. I asked your co-worker Jenna for your anniversary date at Morrison and Klein, and I've marked your birthday and your promotion anniversary. I want to acknowledge those days the way I've always acknowledged Emily's. She paused. I'm sorry it took me 61 years to learn how to do this. Thank you, I managed. Emily took a shaky breath. I'll start paying back the $2,400 in tuition at $200 a month. It'll take a year, but I'll do it. And Mason started seeing Patel's colleague, Dr. Rivera, last week for individual sessions about respect and consequences. I hadn't known that. The fact that Emily had already started taking action before this session meant something. Then Emily said something that made my jaw drop. I'm also selling my handbag collection. The designer ones I bought during the spa's good years. I got them appraised, they're worth about $8,000. Those bags were bought with borrowed money and credit cards. Money I should have been using to pay you back or cover Mason's tuition. I need to rebuild my life from honesty, not appearances. I stared at her. Emily loved those bags. She'd shown them off constantly on social media, used them as props for spa photos, treated them like trophies. Emily, I said carefully, are you sure? I'm sure. They represent everything I was doing wrong. Spending money I didn't have to look successful while you quietly paid for everything. I don't want to be that person anymore. After the session ended, James was waiting in the parking lot. He'd been coming to some sessions, but mostly stayed quiet. As I walked to my car, he approached me. Christina, can I talk to you for a minute? I stopped wary. James had always been kind to me, but he was Emily's husband. His loyalty was to her. I just wanted to say thank you, he said, for doing what I couldn't. Emily needed this wake-up call. Our marriage is stronger now because she's finally being real with me. She stopped hiding debt stopped pretending everything is fine, stopped using other people to avoid dealing with her problems. You saved my family by refusing to enable hers. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't trying to save anyone. I was just trying to save myself. I know, but sometimes that's the same thing. He smiled sadly. Emily's in real therapy now. She's facing things about herself that she's avoided for years. That wouldn't have happened if you'd kept being the safety net. So thank you. When I got back in my car, I sat for a long moment before starting the engine. Something was shifting. Something real. It wasn't fixed, nowhere close to fixed. But for the first time, I felt like maybe we were building something honest instead of just patching over the cracks. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel. Session 6 homework for next week. Family creates a resolution plan for the mortgage situation. Christina, you listen with open mind. Everyone else presents realistic options with no expectation of Christina's money. See you next Thursday. I stared at the message. The mortgage. The thing that had started all of this. The financial trap that had destroyed my credit and revealed the depth of their deception. It was time to figure out what happened next. And this time, they'd have to do it without expecting me to be their solution. Session 6 arrived on a cold November evening, almost exactly 4 months after the dress incident that had blown apart my family. I walked into Dr. Patel's office to find my parents already there, Dad holding a folder thick with papers. Emily sat beside them, her usual designer bag replaced with a simple canvas tote. Christina, Dr. Patel greeted me warmly. Your parents asked to present first today. They've been working on something. I sat down, my stomach tight with anxiety. This was it, the mortgage solution. The thing that would tell me whether all this therapy, all this emotional labour had actually changed anything fundamental. Dad opened the folder with hands that shook slightly. We hired a financial advisor, paid for it with money from my extra shifts at the hardware store. We wanted to do this right without just hoping you'd fix it for us. That alone surprised me. They'd spent money on professional help instead of just asking me. We've decided to sell the house, Mum said quietly. It's worth about $320,000 in the current market. After we pay off the remaining mortgage balance of $160,000, we'll have $160,000 left. Dad slid a printed spreadsheet across to me. It was detailed, colour-coded, showing every number with painful clarity. We found a 2-bedroom condo in a 55-plus community. $180,000 cash purchase, no mortgage. We'd own it outright. I stared at the numbers, trying to process. They were really doing this, selling the house they'd lived in for 30 years. The remaining $140,000 would be split like this. Dad continued, pointing to the breakdown. $30,000 to pay off all our credit card debt and the home equity line we took out in 2019. $20,000 into an emergency fund that we won't touch. The rest goes toward retirement savings. I noticed a line item that made my throat tight. $800 to $500, repayment to Christina for emergency loans. We want to pay you back, Mum said. For all those times we borrowed money and never repaid it. It's not everything, we know that. But it's a start. I looked at that number for a long moment, thinking about all the spreadsheets I'd made, all the resentment I'd carried, all the years of feeling used. And then I realised something. I didn't want their money. That's not what this had ever been about. No, I said, and Mom's face fell. Put that in a college fund for Mason, an actual fund in his name that can't be touched for anything else. I want monthly statements proving it's untouched. Teach him that education is valued, not manipulated. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Christina. This was never about the money, I interrupted. It was about respect, about being seen, about not being treated like a resource instead of a person. The money doesn't matter. Teaching Mason better patterns than we had, that matters. Mum reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. For once, I didn't pull away. When do you list the house? I asked, refocusing on the practical. Next week, Dad said. The realtor thinks it will sell within 60 days, maybe faster. The market's still decent. Closing would be 90 to 120 days after that. I did the math. Another 3 to 4 months. And until then? We keep making the mortgage payments on time, Dad said firmly. Every month. You can keep monitoring the account. We understand you need to protect your credit until this is done. Judge Patel leaned forward. Christina, how does this plan feel to you? Terrifying, I admitted, because it means trusting that they'll follow through, that this isn't just talk. That's fair, Dr. Patel said. Trust is rebuilt slowly through consistent action over time. Your family is proposing a plan that will take months to execute. That's months of opportunity to prove they mean what they say. 2 weeks later, Mum called and asked if I'd come see the house before it was listed. I'd been avoiding going there, too many memories tangled with too much pain, but something in her voice made me say yes. When I arrived, the house looked different, smaller somehow, or maybe I was just seeing it through different eyes. Mum walked me through each room, pointing out things that would be packed away, donated, left behind. Then she stopped at the doorframe between the kitchen and hallway, the one with pencil marks tracking Emily's and my heights through childhood. Dozens of lines, dates written beside them in Mum's handwriting. Look, Mum said, her finger tracing the marks. I measured you both so carefully. Every birthday, every year. But I never really saw you, did I? I saw the measurements, but I didn't see the person growing. She turned to me, her eyes wet. This house holds all my failures as a mother. Maybe leaving it will help me remember what actually matters. Maybe a smaller space will force me to focus on the people instead of the place. It was the most honest thing Mum had ever said to me. Not an excuse, not a justification, just raw acknowledgement of what she'd done wrong. I think that's the point, I said quietly. Of all of this, stripping away everything that let you avoid seeing me. The next 4 months were strange. I went back to my normal life work friends, my quiet apartment, but with weekly therapy sessions and monthly family dinners. The dinners were awkward at first, everyone too careful, too polite. But slowly they became more real. Dad told bad jokes. Emily talked about her spa without exaggerating its success. Mum asked me about work and actually listened to the answers. The house sold in 6 weeks, faster than expected. A young couple with a baby thrilled about the big backyard. Closing was scheduled for early March. I monitored the mortgage account religiously. Every payment appeared on time. Every single one. Sarah, my lawyer, stayed copied on all the communications. They're doing it, she said during one of our check-ins. They're actually following through. On March 15th, I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with an email from the title company. Property sale complete. Co-signer obligation terminated. Final documents attached. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, locked the stall door, and stared at that email. The mortgage was gone. My name was off it. My credit would recover. I was free. I'd wanted this for months, fought for this, built my entire strategy around getting to this exact moment. So why did I feel so unmoored, so strangely empty? For 35 years I'd been the family rescuer, the responsible one, the ATM, the safety net. It had hurt me, drained me, nearly destroyed me. But it had also been my identity, my role, my place in the family constellation. Now I was just Christina. Not Christina who pays for everything. Not Christina the strong one who doesn't need help. Just Christina. And I had absolutely no idea who that person was supposed to be. While the house sale crept toward closing over those months, something else was happening that I only learned about in pieces. Mason was changing too. Emily had enrolled him in a youth volunteer program at St. Catherine's Senior Living Centre, the same hospital complex where Dad had been treated. 12 consecutive Saturdays, 3 hours each session. It was part of Dr. Rivera's treatment plan, part of teaching Mason about accountability and respect. I didn't see much of Mason during this time. Our interactions were limited to brief hellos at family dinners, awkward conversations where he seemed afraid to say the wrong thing. But Emily would mention him occasionally during therapy sessions, reporting on his progress with the kind of wonder that suggested she was discovering her son for the first time. "He asked me yesterday why I never made him apologise to people when he was younger," Emily had said during one session. "Not just to Christina, but to anyone. He said he's meeting all these old people who have stories about family members who hurt them and never said sorry, and he's starting to understand what that does to people." I'd felt something shift in my chest when she said that, but I'd kept my expression neutral. Mason's growth was Emily's responsibility, not mine. I couldn't let myself get pulled back into fixing their family dynamics. The week after I received the email about the mortgage being terminated, I showed up to therapy feeling hollowed out and strange. Everyone noticed immediately. "You look different," Mum said, studying my face. "Did something happen?" "The house closed," I said simply. "I got the email on Friday. The co-signer obligation is officially terminated." The room went quiet. This was the goal we'd all been working toward for months, but now that it had arrived, no one seemed to know how to react. "That's wonderful," Dr. Patel said gently. "How do you feel?" "Lost," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel relieved, free, but I just feel lost." Before anyone could respond, there was a soft knock on Dr. Patel's door. She glanced at her watch, then smiled. "Right on time. Come in, Mason." The door opened and Mason entered, looking nervous but determined. He was carrying something small wrapped in tissue paper. Emily's expression suggested she knew what was happening, but the rest of us were clearly surprised. "Hi, Auntie Christina," Mason said, walking directly to where I sat. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course." He held out the tissue-wrapped package with both hands. "I made you something. Well, not made. I bought it. But I bought it with my own money that I earned by saving my allowance for 12 weeks. I took the package carefully, my throat already tight. Inside was a simple silver necklace with a small charm that read "Family" in cursive script. It was the kind of thing you'd find at a mall. Kiosk probably cost about $60, and it was one of the most meaningful gifts I'd ever received. "Mason," I whispered, "this is beautiful." "I wanted to replace what I broke," he said, his voice serious in that way children get when they're trying to express something beyond their years. "Not the dress, because I can't buy you a dress as nice as that one. But trust. I know $60 doesn't fix it, but it's all I earned myself. I wanted you to have something I worked for, instead of something my mum bought." I looked up at Emily, who was crying silently, then back at Mason. "Can I tell you why I got this at the senior centre?" Mason continued. "There's this lady there, Miss Chen. She's 82 and her son stole $5,000 from her retirement fund 20 years ago. He never apologised. She said she forgave him because he's her son, but trust never came back. They don't talk anymore. They're strangers." Mason's voice cracked slightly. "She told me that betrayal doesn't dissolve in blood, that being family doesn't mean you get unlimited chances to hurt people. And I realised that's what I did to you. I betrayed your trust, and Mum taught me it was okay, because you're family and you're tough. But Mrs. Chen taught me that's wrong." I couldn't speak. I just sat there holding the $60 necklace that represented 12 weeks of a 9-year-old saving his allowance, learning about consequences, understanding that some things can't be fixed with words alone. "I'm sorry," Mason said. "Really sorry. Not because Mum made me say it. Because I understand now why what I did was wrong." I unclasped the necklace and put it on immediately. Mason You just taught me something really important. You taught me that apologies mean nothing without changed actions. Thank you for showing me you understand that. I forgive you, and I'm really proud of the young man you're becoming." He hugged me then properly, and I hugged him back. Over his shoulder, I saw Emily watching us, her face crumpling with what looked like grief and hope mixed together. She was seeing, I thought, the kind of mother she should have been all along, the kind who taught her son about genuine accountability instead of performative apologies. After the session ended and we were gathering our things, I made a decision. "I need to take a trip," I announced, "alone, for a few weeks." Mum looked alarmed. "A trip where, Miss, I don't know yet. Somewhere quiet, maybe the coast." I looked around at all of them. "The mortgage is settled. You're all in therapy. You're making real changes. But I need space to process everything. I need to figure out who I am outside of this family dynamic, outside of being the person who solves everyone's problems." "Are you coming back?" Emily asked, her voice small. I met her eyes. "Yes, but I need to leave first. I need to remember who Christina is when she's not busy being the strong one, or the responsible one, or the convenient one. Just Christina." Dad nodded slowly. "How long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'll stay in touch, but I need this." Mum started to protest, then stopped herself. I saw her visibly swallow whatever she'd been about to say. "Okay, if that's what you need." It was the first time in my life my mother had accepted my boundary without argument, and somehow that acceptance made me more certain than ever that leaving for a while was exactly the right thing to do. That night, I booked a rental house in a small coastal town in Oregon. 3 weeks, starting next Monday. No plan, no agenda, no family obligations. Just me, the ocean, and the space to figure out who I was supposed to be now that I wasn't anyone's rescuer anymore. I left on a Monday morning in late March, my car packed with a single suitcase and my laptop. The drive to Cannon Beach took 11 hours and I barely registered most of it. My mind was too busy cycling through everything that had happened, everything that was still happening, everything I still didn't know how to feel about. The rental house was perfect. A small cottage 2 blocks from the beach, weathered grey shingles and white trim. A front porch with a swing that creaked in the wind. Off-season rates meant I had the place for 3 weeks for less than what I used to spend on my family's expenses in a single month. The irony wasn't lost on me. The first morning, I woke to the sound of seagulls and didn't know what to do with myself. No emails demanding my attention, no therapy appointments to prepare for, no family dinners to steel myself against. Just empty hours stretching ahead like the beach outside my window. So I walked, miles and miles of empty sand, the ocean grey and churning wind, whipping my hair into tangles I didn't bother to fix. I thought about nothing, deliberately, intentionally, nothing. Just the rhythm of my feet on wet sand, the cry of birds, the cold spray of salt water when the waves came too close. By the end of the first week, a routine had emerged without me consciously creating it. Morning beach walks, afternoon work. I'd brought my laptop and was technically on vacation, but I found myself logging in for a few hours each day. The difference was that now I logged off at 4 instead of 7. I set boundaries with my job the way I'd learnt to set them with my family, and the world didn't end. My clients survived. My projects continued. I was allowed to have a life outside of work, just like I was allowed to have a life outside of my family's needs. Evenings, I sat on the porch with a journal and wrote. Long, rambling entries that I'd never show anyone. I spent years filling everyone's cups. I wrote one night watching the sunset turn the ocean gold. I never noticed mine was bone dry.
Yes.
On my 10th day there, I discovered a small art gallery tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore. The sign read Sea Glass Studio in weathered letters. Inside, watercolour paintings lined the walls, all depicting the Oregon coast in various moods and seasons. An older woman emerged from the back room, wiping paint-stained hands on an apron. She was probably in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a messy bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Just browsing or looking for something specific?" she asked. "Just browsing." But I found myself staying, looking at each painting carefully. There was something about them that felt honest, unpolished, in a way that made them more beautiful rather than less. "I'm Diane," the woman said, appearing beside me with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you need this." I took the cup gratefully and introduced myself. We ended up sitting in her studio for over an hour, talking the way strangers sometimes can when they'll never see each other again. I told her about the family situation in broad strokes, leaving out identifying details. She listened without judgment. "I didn't speak to my sister for 10 years, Diane said finally. "It started over money she borrowed $5,000 and never paid it back, but it became about everything else. All the resentments we'd been carrying since childhood. I set boundaries, which was the right thing to do. But then I let the bitterness poison everything. I stayed angry for a decade." She stared into her coffee cup. "She died of cancer 3 years ago. We never reconciled. And now I have to live with that for the rest of my life. My biggest regret isn't that I set boundaries. It's that I let the anger prevent me from seeing when she tried to change. She reached out twice, and I ignored her both times because I was still so angry. And then it was too late." "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Don't be. Just learn from it." Diane looked at me directly. "Setting boundaries is survival. Holding on to bitterness after people genuinely change is just another kind of prison. Make sure you know the difference." Before I left, I bought one of her paintings. It was titled Low Tide and showed a stretch of beach with the water pulled back, revealing tide pools full of starfish, anemones, and tiny darting fish. The colours were muted but alive greys and greens and unexpected flashes of orange and purple. "Low tide exposes what high tide hides," Diane explained as she wrapped it. "Sometimes we need the water to recede to see the beauty underneath. It's ugly when everything is exposed, all those rocks and seaweed and dead things washed up. But it's also when you find the real treasures, the things that survive." I carried that painting back to my cottage and propped it against the wall, staring at it while I made dinner. Uncovering truth was like low tide. Painful, ugly, exposing all the decay and damage. But also necessary, also beautiful in its own harsh way. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I'd been keeping my phone mostly off, checking it once a day for emergencies. This wasn't an emergency number, just a regular email, but the subject line made my hand freeze. "Letter I wrote but never sent," from Mom's email address. My finger hovered over the notification. Part of me didn't want to open it. Didn't want whatever was in that email to disturb the peace I'd been building in this quiet coastal town. But the other part, the part that was still my mother's daughter, despite everything needed to know. I opened the email. There was no message body, just an attachment. A scanned document pages yellowed with age handwriting I'd recognise anywhere. Mum's careful script, the same handwriting that had labelled my childhood lunchboxes and signed my permission slips. The date at the top made my breath catch 5 years ago. This letter was 5 years old, written and never sent, hidden away, and now finally shared. I sat down on the edge of the bed, Mason's necklace cool against my chest. Diane's painting propped against the wall, the sound of the ocean through the open window. And I started to read my mother's confession from half a decade ago. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on stationery that Mum used to use before she switched to email for everything. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and there were coffee ring stains on the second page. This wasn't something she'd written yesterday and scanned. This was real old, kept hidden for 5 years. "My darling Christina," it began, and I had to pause because Mum never called me darling. That word was reserved for Emily, for Mason, never for me. I'm writing this because I'm too ashamed to say it aloud, and maybe too much of a coward to even send this letter after I finish it. You moved into your first apartment today. You were so proud showing me around your little studio with its tiny kitchen and the view of the parking lot you pretended was charming. And all I could think was, I don't know how to love you the way you need. My hands shook. I set the phone down on the bed and picked it back up, needing to keep reading. You've never needed me the way Emily did. From the time you were small, you were self-sufficient. You figured things out on your own. You didn't cry when you were hurt. You didn't call me when you had problems. And instead of celebrating your independence, instead of being proud that I'd raised such a capable person, I resented it. I resented that you didn't need me, because needing me made me feel like I mattered. I thought about Mum's own confession in therapy, about being the invisible middle child. This letter was written 5 years before that therapy session, but the same wound was bleeding through every word. I gave Emily all the attention I craved as a child. Every bit of validation I never got, I poured into her. And I told myself it was fair because she needed it more. But the truth is, I forgot that you needed it too. I forgot that just because you could survive without constant attention didn't mean you should have to. I forgot that strength isn't the absence of need. It's just quieter about expressing it. Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them away impatiently, needing to see the words. I don't know if I can change. I'm 61 years old and I've been this way my entire adult life. But I want you to know that I see my failure, even if I can't fix it. I see how I've made you invisible. I see how you've paid for everything, and I've never said thank you. I see how your accomplishments go unnoticed, while Emily's struggles get sympathy and support. I see it all, Christina. All. I just don't know how to stop doing it. The letter ended with, I'm sorry. I'm so desperately sorry. And I'm too ashamed to send this because sending it would mean I'd have to change, and I don't know if I'm strong enough. I love you. I hope you know that even though I've never shown it the way you needed. Mum. I sat there on the bed in my rented cottage, ocean sounds filtering through the window, holding proof that my mother had known exactly what she was doing to me for at least 5 years. She'd seen it, named it, apologised for it in a letter she'd never sent because actually changing was too hard. It should have made me angrier, should have felt like confirmation that her neglect was willful, not accidental. But instead, I felt something crack open in my chest that wasn't rage. It was grief. Grief for my mother trapped in her own childhood wound, unable to break free from patterns even when she could see them destroying her daughter. Grief for both of us, caught in a cycle neither of us had chosen, but both of us had perpetuated. She'd been trapped in her own pain and had trapped me in the aftermath. But she'd seen it. Even when she couldn't stop it, she'd seen it. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and called her. It was nearly midnight in Oregon, which meant it was nearly 3 a.m. where she was. But I couldn't. Wait, she answered on the second ring voice, thick with sleep and instant panic. Christina, is everything okay? Are you hurt? I'm fine. I just read your letter, the one from 5 years ago. Silence, then a sound that might have been a sob. Oh God, I shouldn't have sent that. I wasn't thinking clearly. I found it when we were packing up the house, and I thought you should know that I knew that it wasn't just ignorance that I saw what I was doing even back then. Mum, I interrupted gently, why didn't you send it when you wrote it? More crying. Because sending it would mean I'd have to change. I'd have to admit out loud that I was failing you, and then you'd expect me to fix it, and I didn't know how. It was easier to just keep going the way we'd always gone. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I looked at Diane's painting at the exposed tide pools with their hidden treasures. I know you're trying now. I can see it. The therapy, the acknowledgement, all of it. It's late, Mum. It's 5 years too late. Maybe 35 years too late, but late is better than never. Is it? Mum's voice broke. Is it better, or have I just done too much damage? I thought about Diane and her sister, who died before they could reconcile. I thought about the mortgage crisis that had exposed all our family dysfunction, but also forced us into therapy. I thought about Mason's necklace against my chest, proof that change was possible, even in the next generation. "It's better," I said firmly. "But Mum, I need you to understand something. I'm forgiving you for me, not for you. I'm choosing to let go of this weight because carrying it is destroying me. That doesn't mean everything's fine. It doesn't mean I trust you completely. It means I'm choosing not to let your mistakes control my life anymore." "I understand. That's more than I deserve." We talked for another 20 minutes, and for the first time in my life, it felt like my mother was actually listening to me instead of waiting for her turn to talk. After we hung up, I opened my journal and wrote, "Forgiveness isn't saying what they did was okay. It's choosing to stop letting their mistakes control my life. I forgive them for my freedom, not for their absolution. I deserve to live without this weight, and so I'm setting it down not for them, but for me." The next morning, I booked a flight home, 1 week earlier than planned. I'd found what I came here looking for, not in the empty beach or the quiet cottage, but in the space between anger and acceptance. In the recognition that I could forgive without forgetting, could move forward without pretending the past hadn't happened. I texted the family group chat, "Coming home next Wednesday, let's have dinner, I'm ready to try again, but on new terms." 3 responses came almost immediately. "Mum, we'll be there. Emily, thank you for coming back. Dad, I'll make my famous chili." I smiled, touched Mason's necklace, and started packing my things. It was time to go home, not to the family I'd left, but to the family we were all learning to become. I arrived at my parents' new condo on a warm July evening, carrying a bottle of wine and a knot of nervousness in my stomach. The complex was nice, not as prestigious as their old neighbourhood, but newer with well-maintained landscaping and a pool nobody seemed to use. I found their unit on the second floor, number 247, and stood outside the door for a moment, listening to voices and laughter inside. This was it, the test of whether everything we'd worked through in therapy was real or just performative. I knocked, and Dad opened the door with a smile that reached his eyes. "Christina, come in. You found it okay." "GPS works wonders," I said, stepping inside. The condo was small compared to the house I'd grown up in. The living room and kitchen were one open space, 2 bedrooms down a short hall, 1 bathroom visible through an open door. But it was cosy, warm. Mum had hung the good family photos, the ones that included me, not just the ones that featured Emily and Mason prominently. "You made it." Mum emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She hugged me, and it felt natural instead of obligatory. "Emily just got here with the salad. Mason's setting the table." I walked into the dining area and stopped. The small table had place settings for 5, and at the head of the table was a place card that read, "Christina, guest of honour," in Mum's careful handwriting. "Mum," I said, my throat tight. "It's your night," she said simply. "We wanted you to know that." Emily appeared with a bowl of salad, and Mason was indeed setting out forks and knives with the concentration of a 9-year-old trying very hard to get it right. Dad pulled out a casserole dish out of the oven, his famous chili as promised. I'd brought wine. Everyone had contributed. It wasn't transactional anymore. It was collaborative. We sat down to eat, and before anyone touched their food, Dad cleared his throat. "I want to start with gratitude. It's something Dr. Patel suggested we try. Everyone shares one thing they're grateful for about Christina." I felt my face flush. "Dad, you don't have to." "I'm grateful," he interrupted gently, "that Christina had the courage to hold us accountable when it would have been easier to just accept how things were. She saved this family by refusing to let us destroy her." Mum went next, her voice wavering. "I'm grateful she gave us a chance to change instead of just cutting us off completely. I'm grateful every day that she's still here." Emily's eyes were already wet. "I'm grateful she taught me that real love includes respect. That family isn't just about who's related to you, but about how you treat each other. I'm becoming a better person because of her. Mason, sitting up very straight, said seriously, I'm grateful Auntie Christina taught me that actions matter more than words, and that everyone deserves respect, even people who seem strong. I had to press my napkin against my eyes. Thank you, all of you. This means more than you know. Dinner conversation flowed in a way it never had before. Dad asked me about work, and when I mentioned I was being considered for a senior director position, he actually listened to my explanation of what that would entail instead of glazing over. Mum asked about Oregon, remembered the name of the town from my texts, wanted to know about the beach and the art gallery, and whether I'd tried the clam chowder. Emily shared an update about her spa revenue was stabilising after she'd cut expenses and focused on sustainable growth instead of appearances. I'm thinking about maybe adding a meditation room, she said, but I wanted to get your opinion first. You're good with numbers and projections. I blinked. You want my business advice? Of course, you're a financial analyst. Why wouldn't I ask you? Emily pulled out her phone and showed me some preliminary numbers. I gave her honest feedback and she took notes. Actually took notes on what I was saying. After dinner, as we were clearing plates, Dad's car alarm started going off in the parking lot. He sighed, grabbed his keys and headed outside. 10 minutes later, he came back in. Battery's dead. I called away. They'll be here in 30 minutes. He didn't ask me to handle it, didn't even look at me expectantly. He just dealt with it himself. Emily's phone rang during dessert. She glanced at the screen, grimaced. It's the spa. I'm so sorry. I need to take this. She stepped into the hallway and I could hear her handling some kind of emergency with a difficult client. She came back 10 minutes later apologising. All handled. Where were we? She dealt with her own crisis independently, without needing me to fix it. Mum started to say something, then stopped herself mid-sentence. Christina, can you? She paused, smiled at herself. Never mind. I can look up that recipe online myself. 3 small moments, 3 tests passed, 3 indicators that the changes were real, lasting, becoming habit rather than performance. I left around 9, hugging everyone goodbye, promising to come back for dinner next month. As I drove home through the warm summer night, my phone buzzed with an email notification. Work email. I glanced at it, at a red light. Subject, senior director position, offer inside. My heart leapt. I'd gotten it. The promotion I'd been working toward for years. Senior Director of Finance. A team of 8 reports. Significant salary increase. Everything I'd worked for. And my first thought, my immediate instinctive reaction was, I need to tell my family. Not, they won't care. Not, they'll find a way to make it about Emily. Just pure excitement to share good news with people who would actually celebrate it. I pulled over and called Mum. She answered on the second ring. Christina, did you forget something? I got the promotion, I said, unable to keep the joy out of my voice. Senior Director. They just sent the offer. Mum screamed, actually screamed with excitement. Robert, Emily, Christina got her promotion. Then to me, oh sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. We're celebrating this weekend. Proper celebration. Your choice of restaurant. I could hear Dad and Emily cheering in the background. Genuine, enthusiastic, unrestrained celebration of my achievement. I sat in my parked car, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my family be happy for me, and realised this was what I'd been missing my entire life. Not the money, not the acknowledgement of my financial contributions. Just this, being seen, being celebrated, being valued for who I was, rather than what I could provide. Thank you, Mum, I whispered. I'll see you this weekend. As I drove the rest of the way home, Mason's necklace caught the streetlight and gleamed. Family. Not the one I was born into, but the one we were building together. One honest conversation and genuine celebration at a time. The promotion became official on September 20th, exactly 1 year to the day after the dress incident. I didn't mention the anniversary to anyone, but I noticed it. How could I not? 1 year ago, I'd stood in my parents' dining room in a torn $320 dress, watching my family laugh at my humiliation. Today, I was signing papers that made me Senior Director of Finance at Morrison & Klein, with a salary of $180,000. A team of 8 direct reports and influence I'd been building toward for 5 years. The timing felt like the universe offering me a before and after comparison. Before Invisible Christina, the family, ATM, the responsible one who absorbed everyone's chaos. After Christina, who'd fought her way to being seen, who'd demanded respect and gotten it, who'd discovered she could be strong and vulnerable simultaneously. Mum's flowers arrived at my office that afternoon, a massive arrangement of sunflowers and white roses, with a card that read, "You did this is through strength and vulnerability. So proud to be your mother, love you." I cried at my desk, which was new. The old Christina would have swallowed the tears and composed herself. The new Christina let herself feel things. The celebration dinner happened that weekend at a steakhouse I'd always wanted to try, but thought was too expensive. Emily had made the reservation and insisted on treating, not from her struggling spa income, but from the proceeds of selling those designer handbags. Dad wore a tie. Mum brought a wrapped present that turned out to be a leather portfolio with my initials embossed on it. Mason had made me a card decorated with drawings of office buildings and stick figures labelled Boss Christina. Before we ordered, Emily stood up with her wine glass raised. "I want to make a toast," she said, her voice clear and steady. "To Christina, the woman who taught us that you can be strong and still need support, who showed us that love without respect is just exploitation dressed up in family obligation, who gave us the painful gift of accountability when it would have been easier to just walk away forever." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "Christina, you saved this family by refusing to let us destroy you. You taught Mason what real apologies look like. You taught me what real responsibility feels like. You taught Mom and Dad that they had 2 daughters, not just one who needed attention, and one who could survive without it. To Christina." Everyone echoed the toast, and I had to set down my own glass because my hands were shaking. "Thank you," I managed. "All of you, for doing the work, for showing up to therapy every week, even when it was hard, for actually changing instead of just promising to change." Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We're the ones who should be thanking you." But the most meaningful change came a few months later when I used my new position's influence to start something I'd been thinking about since my conversation with Sarah, my lawyer. I proposed a mentoring program to HR, financial literacy and boundaries for women. It would be voluntary meeting monthly during lunch hours, teaching younger female employees about the things I'd learnt the hard way. Credit protection, co-signing risks, how to recognise financial enmeshment in families, how to set boundaries without guilt, how to protect yourself from exploitation by people who claim they're just asking for help because you're family. The first session had 12 attendees. By the third session, we had 35. Women my age and younger, many of them, with stories that sounded disturbingly familiar. My parents expect me to pay for my brother's wedding. My sister keeps borrowing money and never paying it back. My family thinks I'm selfish for saying no. I taught them what I wished someone had taught me at 25. You can love your family and still have boundaries. You can be generous and still protect yourself. You can be strong and still need people to see you. The program became one of the most well-attended voluntary initiatives the company had ever run. HR asked me to present it at our quarterly all-hands meeting. I stood in front of 200 employees and told a carefully edited version of my story, enough to illustrate why this mattered not so much that I violated my family's privacy. Afterward, a 26-year-old analyst named Rebecca approached me, her eyes red. "Thank you," she whispered. I thought I was crazy for being angry that my family expects me to fund everyone's lives. You made me feel like I'm allowed to have boundaries. You are, I told her firmly. You're not just allowed. You're required to have them. Boundaries aren't selfish. They're survival. 6 months passed in what felt like the healthiest routine I'd ever had. Work that challenged me. Family dinners once a month where I was celebrated, not exploited. Therapy sessions that had shifted from crisis management to maintenance. A life that finally felt like mine. Then one December afternoon, a card arrived in my mailbox. Hand-addressed Emily's handwriting. Inside was a check for $1,200 and a note written on plain stationery. Christina, I've been paying you back $200 a month for the tuition debt. This is month 6. But I sold the last of my handbags, and I want to pay off the remaining balance now instead of dragging it out another 9 months. Thank you for teaching me that debts aren't just about money, they're about integrity. I love you. Emily. I stared at that check at my sister's handwriting, at proof that she was following through on her promises, even when I wasn't watching, even when no one was forcing her to. The old Christina would have been satisfied with this, would have filed it away as evidence that she'd been right all along. The new Christina called Emily and said, thank you, not just for the money, for showing me that people really can change. Emily had laughed through tears during that phone call, and we talked for an hour about everything and nothing, about her spa's slow but steady growth, about Mason's progress in therapy, about how James had told her last week that she seemed lighter, happier, more herself than she'd been in years. I am, Emily had said. For the first time, I'm not pretending to be successful. I'm actually building something real. It's slower and harder and less glamorous, but it's mine. The months that followed were proof that the changes weren't temporary performances, but genuine transformations embedding themselves into the fabric of how we related to each other. In March, Dad called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Hey, kiddo, quick question. My buddy recommended a mechanic for an oil change, but he's charging $80. That seem high to you? Depends on the service. I said, what's included? I'm not sure. Full synthetic oil, filter fluid, top-off tyre rotation. That's actually reasonable for full synthetic, but if you want a second opinion, Tom's Auto on 6th Street is good. I've used them for years. Thanks, I'll give them a call. Dad paused. Appreciate the help. That was it. No expectation that I'd handle it for him, no assumption that I'd pay for it. Just a dad asking his daughter for advice and then managing it himself. Later that evening, he texted, Tom's gave me the same quote, got it done. Guy you recommended was great and fair priced. Thanks. A small thing. But small things were the real test of lasting change. Then there was Emily's spa emergency. I only found out about it a week after it happened, when Emily mentioned it casually during a family dinner. Sorry, I look tired, she'd said, stifling a yawn. We had a pipe burst in the massage room last week, $3,000 in repairs. I've been dealing with insurance and contractors all week. Wait, what? I'd set down my fork. A pipe burst. Why didn't you call me? Emily had looked genuinely confused. Why would I call you? It's my business. I called James first to talk through the options. Then I worked out a payment plan with the contractor. Insurance covered about 60%. It's handled. I'd sat there processing. Emily had faced a crisis, the kind of crisis that would have sent her running to me a year and a half ago, and she'd handled it herself. Called her husband, negotiated with contractors, made adult decisions without expecting me to rescue her. I'm proud of you, I'd said and meant it completely. Thanks, Emily had smiled. I'm kind of proud of me too. But the moment that really got me came via email 2 weeks ago. Emily had sent a message with the subject line, "You need to read this," and an attachment labelled Mason Essay Doc X. I'd opened it during my lunch break and had to close my office door because I started crying. The Bravest Person I Know by Mason Hartwell. Grade 4. When I think about bravery, I don't think about superheroes or soldiers. I think about my Aunt Christina. Most people think brave means not being scared, but my aunt taught me that brave means being scared and doing the hard thing anyway. 2 years ago, I did something really mean to my aunt. I ripped her dress in front of everyone at a party. I thought it was funny because my mum told me my aunt was tough and wouldn't mind. But I was wrong. I hurt her feelings really bad. My aunt could have just stayed mad forever. She could have never talked to us again. But instead, she did something really brave. She told our whole family that we were treating her wrong. She made us go to therapy and learn how to be better people. She stood up to people she loved when they were wrong, even though it was really hard. My aunt taught me that strong people still have feelings. She taught me that saying sorry means changing your actions, not just saying words. She taught me that love means respect, not just being related to someone. I want to be like my Aunt Christina when I grow up, not because she's rich or successful, even though she is, but because she's brave enough to tell the truth, even when it's hard. That's the bravest thing I can think of. I'd read it 3 times, each time crying harder. This was Mason at 9 years old, understanding concepts about boundaries and respect that most adults struggled with, understanding that his aunt had saved their family, not by continuing to enable them, but by refusing to. I'd called Emily immediately. "Did you read this?" "Yeah." Emily's voice had been thick. "His teacher sent it to me first, asked if it was okay to share it at the school assembly next month." I said, "Yes." This is incredible. He really gets it." "He does. Better than I did at his age. Better than I did 6 months ago, honestly." Emily had paused. "You did that. You broke the cycle for him. We all did it together." My phone rang now as I was reviewing quarterly reports, pulling me from the memory. Unknown local number, but something made me answer. "Hello. Is this Ms. Christina Hartwell?" A woman's voice, professional and warm. "Yes, speaking." "This is Principal Martinez from Oakwood Elementary. I'm calling about your nephew, Mason Hartwell." My stomach dropped. "Is he okay?" "Oh, he's fine." She laughed. "I'm sorry, I should have led with that. I'm calling because Mason listed you as an emergency contact this year, and he also specifically requested that you present his Community Service Award at our achievement ceremony next Thursday. Would you be available?" I stared at my computer screen. Mason's essay still open in another window. "He wants me to present his award." He was very insistent. He said, "You're the person who taught him why community service matters. The ceremony is Thursday at 6 p.m. in the school auditorium. We'd love to have you." "Yes," I said, not even checking my calendar. "Yes, I'll be there." "Wonderful. I'll email you the details. And Ms. Hartwell, that essay Mason wrote about you. It was the best piece of writing I've seen from a 4th grader in my 15 years of teaching. You've clearly made quite an impact on him." After we hung up, I sat at my desk with my hand over my heart, feeling Mason's necklace under my blouse. The boy who'd ripped my dress 18 months ago wanted me to present his Community Service Award. The boy I'd almost written off as a lost cause had grown into someone who understood respect and accountability better than most adults I knew. We really had broken the cycle. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change the trajectory of the next generation. I pulled up my calendar and blocked off Thursday evening. Nothing was going to make me miss this. Thursday evening arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that makes everything feel like possibility. I'd taken the afternoon off work, gone home to change into something nice, but not too formal, and driven to Oakwood Elementary with my heart beating faster than it should for a 4th grade awards ceremony. The parking lot was packed with families. I found a spot near the back and walked toward the school entrance where Emily stood at a check-in table with a clipboard and a name tag that read Parent Volunteer. She looked up, saw me, and her whole face brightened. "You came," she said as if there had been any doubt. "Of course I came. Mason asked me to." "Your seat's saved. Front row between Mom and Dad. Mason insisted." Emily handed me a program. He's so excited, Christina. He's been talking about this all week. Inside the auditorium, I found my parents already seated in the front row. There was a folded piece of paper on the chair between them, with my name written in Mason's careful handwriting. I sat down, and Mum immediately reached over to squeeze my hand. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. "I wouldn't miss it." The ceremony began with Principal Martinez welcoming everyone and explaining the awards: academic excellence, perfect attendance, citizenship, and finally, community service. "This award," she said, "goes to students who have demonstrated exceptional commitment to helping others and understanding their role in making our community better." When Mason's name was called, she added, Mason nominated his Aunt Christina as his most inspiring family member. In his nomination essay, he wrote that she taught him that strong people still have feelings and that apologies require changed actions, not just words. The audience applauded as Mason walked onto the stage, looking nervous and proud in his button-up shirt and carefully combed hair. Principal Martinez gestured for me to join them. I walked up the steps, very aware of the 100+ people watching, and took the certificate from the principal's hands. Mason stood in front of me, his eyes shining. "I'm so proud of you," I said, handing him the certificate. "You've worked so hard for this." He hugged me tight and genuine and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I had to blink back tears as we walked off stage together, the audience still applauding. Several parents stopped me afterward, people I didn't know saying things like, "Your nephew talks about you constantly," and "You've clearly made such an impact on him." I realised standing there in that school auditorium that I was no longer invisible. Not to Mason, not to my family, not even to strangers who'd only heard about me through a 9-year-old's essay. After the ceremony, we went for ice cream. Mason's choice, a place called Sweet Dreams, that had booths shaped like giant ice cream cones. We crammed into one, 5 of us squeezed together, and the conversation flowed naturally. Dad asked about a complex project I was managing at work, and actually listened to my detailed explanation about client acquisitions and team restructuring. Mum told a funny story about getting lost trying to find the new grocery store, and when she got to the punchline, and Christina would have just pulled up GPS like a normal person, but I insisted I knew the way. Everyone laughed with affection, not at my expense. Emily asked my opinion about hiring a business manager for the spa. Now that revenue was consistent, and she pulled out her phone to take notes on what I was saying. Real notes. Writing down my advice like it mattered. Mason showed me photos of his science project on his tablet. Something about water filtration, and was so excited to explain it that his ice cream melted while he talked. I listened to every word, asked questions, celebrated his enthusiasm. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, not without friction or awkwardness, but real, built on respect and genuine interest rather than obligation and resentment. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman who'd walked into a party 19 months ago, wearing a $320 silk dress, desperate to be noticed, carrying the weight of 35 years of invisibility on her shoulders. That woman had been broken that night. But she hadn't stayed broken. She transformed the breaking into becoming. I'd learned that being needed isn't the same as being valued. That no is a complete sentence that doesn't require justification. That forgiveness is freedom I give myself, not absolution I grant others. That respect isn't given freely. It's taught, demanded, earned through consistent action. My family had broken my trust, but I hadn't broken. I'd set boundaries, demanded change, and given them a chance to rise up and meet me. And they had. Not perfectly. Emily still had moments of falling back into old patterns. Mum and Dad still occasionally slipped into old assumptions. But they tried now. They corrected themselves. They acknowledged when they were wrong. And that was enough. I didn't lose my family. I rebuilt it on my terms. The woman in the ripped dress had been invisible, exhausted, taken for granted, used up and wrung dry. The woman I was now, I was seen. I was rested. I was respected, not because they changed overnight, but because I refused to stay invisible. I touched Mason's necklace at my throat, felt the weight of that simple silver charm that said family, and smiled. They say blood is thicker than water, but I learnt something more important. Respect is thicker than blood. And love without respect is just exploitation dressed up in familial obligation. I had my family back, but more importantly, I had myself. And that was the power they never wanted me to discover. The power to know my worth, to demand to be seen, to build a life where I mattered, not just as a resource, but as a person. I was finally, truly, completely free. And I was going home. And that's where Christina's story brings us today. 19 months after a torn dress exposed 35 years of invisible pain, she sits with Mason's necklace around her neck and a text from Emily asking for business advice, not expecting Christina to solve it, just asking, like sisters do. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. There were setbacks and moments when Christina wondered if demanding change was a mistake. But she'd learned something crucial that night when her family laughed at her humiliation. Being strong didn't mean accepting mistreatment. Being family didn't mean unlimited access to exploit someone's generosity. Love, without respect, is just a prettier word for being used. Christina's story isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. It's about a woman who spent 35 years being invisible, finally demanding to be seen. When her family couldn't see her on their own, she made them look by removing everything they'd taken for granted. The streaming services, the health insurance, the endless financial support, the assumption that Christina would always say yes. What makes this story powerful is that Christina didn't just walk away. She gave her family a roadmap to change, brought them to therapy, and held firm while leaving the door open for genuine transformation. Her family, faced with losing Christina forever, or doing the hard work, chose the work. Not everyone's story ends this way. Sometimes the only healthy choice is to walk away completely. But Christina's family proved that people can grow, patterns can be broken, and it's never too late to start treating each other with respect. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've been the strong one everyone leans on, but no one supports, Christina's story is for you. You can love your family and still protect yourself. You can demand respect without being cruel. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop letting people use you. I want to hear from you. Have you been in a situation like Christina's? How did you handle it? What boundaries have you set with people you love? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If Christina's journey resonated with you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment telling me what part hit you hardest. Was it the party? Her financial discovery, the therapy sessions? Or Mason's redemption? Your engagement creates a community where people wanting basic respect can find validation. Subscribe, comment, and share this with someone who needs Christina's message. Remember what Christina learned. Being needed isn't the same as being valued. No is a complete sentence. Forgiveness is freedom you give yourself. And respect isn't given, it's taught. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be seen.